Tonight we travel beneath the dry earth of ancient Mesopotamia, where one damaged clay tablet preserves a remarkably quiet mystery. In 1914, the scholar Arno Pobel published fragments from a Sumerian tablet excavated at the ancient city of Nippur. The surviving lines described a catastrophic flood, a chosen ruler named Yusudra, and a warning that humanity was approaching destruction. The tablet was already ancient when many famous civilizations were still young. Researchers studying Mesopotamian collection at institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania and the British Museum have spent generations reconstructing these texts. Their work confirms something important. The Sumerians preserved a flood tradition centuries before many later versions became famous around the world. Yet the clay does not give you a complete story. Large portions are omitted, words disappear into cracks, sentences end abruptly, entire moments have been swallowed by damage, leaving you with something strangely appropriate for a story about vanished gods. You are not reading a polished book. You are listening through ruins. Imagine yourself standing near Nippur beneath a pale evening sky. Dust settles against your sandals while irrigation channels carry slow brown water across the plain. The air smells of mud, reeds, smoke, and animals. Beyond the fields rises a temple platform built from sun-dried brick. Its walls catch the final warmth of the day, while somewhere inside, priests prepare food and drink for beings nobody treats as imaginary. For the people living here, the gods belong to the structure of existence. They own cities. They control rivers. They determine kingship, harvests, storms, fertility, sickness, and victory. A god does not simply represent the forces of nature. A god possesses personality, intention, anger, generosity, and sometimes an uncomfortable ability to change direction without explaining why. This is where the mystery begins. The surviving Sumerian flood text suggests that the gods decide to destroy humanity with water. The exact debate behind that decision is partly lost, which leaves scholars with frustrating sense of words, where motives might once have appeared. That silence matters. Later Mesopotamian traditions provide fuller explanations, but the older Sumerian version remains more elusive. Historians still debate how closely its missing portions resembled the narratives preserved in later Akkadian literature. Perhaps the Lost Lands once explained everything. Perhaps they did not. The surviving text introduces Yusudra as a ruler associated with devotion and obedience. He appears not as a rebellious hero challenging heaven, but as someone attentive to divine instruction. Then comes one of the strangest moments in ancient literature. A divine warning reaches him indirectly. The wisdom god does not simply stand before the man and announce what will happen. Instead, communication occurs through a wall or barrier, depending on how scholars reconstruct the damaged passage. You can almost hear the oddness of it. A god wishes to speak without appearing to speak. The detail becomes even more intriguing when placed beside later Mesopotamian flood traditions. In those accounts, the divine council has apparently imposed restrictions against openly warning humanity and says, the solution is wonderfully technical. The god addresses an object. The human happens to listen. Ancient theology occasionally possesses the logic of a very patient lawyer. This peculiar method of communication has fascinated generations of readers because it suggests tension among the gods themselves. Divine power appears immense, yet divine action still seems constrained by agreements, decrees, and competing loyalties. Records from Mesopotamian literature repeatedly show gods gathering in councils and making collective decisions. The divine world often resembles an exaggerated reflection of human political life, complete with authority, rank, disagreement, and negotiation. That resemblance is not accidental. Scholars at Yale University and the University of Chicago have long examined how Mesopotamian religion reflects the institutions surrounding it. Cities had councils, kings, administrators, labour systems, temples, and complicated hierarchies. Heaven often looks surprisingly similar. The gods rule because earthly rulers understand rule. The gods deliberate because human communities deliberate. And when divine decisions become dangerous, humanity has very little influence over the conversation. You stand now in the imagined darkness beside Yasudra. A wall separates him from the unseen speaker. Perhaps there is lamplight behind him. Perhaps the smell of burning oil hangs inside the room while distant insects hum beside the river. Then the warning comes. A flood will destroy the seed of mankind. The wording survives imperfectly, but the direction is unmistakable. Something has gone terribly wrong between humanity and the divine order. This is not merely bad weather. The catastrophe has intention. That distinction changes everything. Floods were familiar realities in southern Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates river systems could nourish fields, reshape channels, destroy settlements, and bury landscapes beneath layers of silt. Archaeologists have indeed discovered flood deposits at several ancient Mesopotamian sites. Those deposits do not demonstrate one universal flood, and specialists disagree about which local disasters may have influenced later traditions. The scholarly debate remains open. Some researchers emphasize memories of severe regional flooding. Others focus more strongly on mythology, literary development, and the symbolic meaning of cosmic destruction. The tablet itself refuses to settle the question. It simply waits. That is perhaps its most unsettling quality. Clay survives differently from memory. A city can disappear, a dynasty can collapse, and a language can fall silent. Yet a tablet buried accidentally beneath debris may continue holding marks made by a human hand. Thousands of years later, you encounter those marks. The person who pressed them into wet clay could never have imagined you. He lived among temple courtyards, reed baskets, livestock, grain accounts, and river mud. His world contained no modern archaeology and no distant museum display. Yet his signs still speak. They tell you that humanity survives. They also suggest that something changes. The gods do not vanish from Mesopotamian religion following the flood tradition. Quite the opposite. They remain central to temples, prayers, kingship, dreams, omens, rituals, and daily uncertainty. But presence is not always closeness. That distinction will quietly shape the mystery. A deity can remain powerful while becoming harder to approach. A god may still determine destiny while speaking through dreams instead of appearing openly. Silence does not necessarily mean absence. Sometimes silence creates authority. You might picture the difference between a crowded royal courtyard and a sealed palace door. The king remains inside either way, but distance changes how everyone behaves outside. People begin watching for signs. They study unusual births, storms, eclipses, dreams, illnesses, birds, smoke, and patterns within sacrificed animals. Entire professions eventually develop around interpreting messages that rarely arrive in ordinary speech. The hidden world becomes increasingly readable only through specialists. It's possible that the flood tradition preserves, in symbolic form, a memory of this growing distance. Perhaps the story does not describe gods physically departing at all. Perhaps it records a transformation in how humans imagine access to them. A once immediate sacred world becomes filtered through temples, priests, kings, rituals, and carefully interpreted signs. The gods remain everywhere, yet they become difficult to meet. For a moment, listen to the evening around ancient Nippur. Water moves through a narrow canal. Reed leaves scratch softly against one another. Somewhere behind a mud brick wall, a priest closes a wooden door. The sky darkens. Nothing supernatural appears. And still, everyone know the gods are there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You can also share where you are listening from and tell us your local time. There is something fitting about people scattered across distant places, gathering quietly around a story preserved in clay. Perhaps you are listening beneath rain. Perhaps your room is completely still. Either way, the same question remains beside you. Why would gods powerful enough to destroy civilization choose afterward to become less visible? The damaged tablet offers no simple answer. Instead, it leaves a doorway half open. And through that narrow opening, you begin to sense that the flood may not only concern destruction, it may describe distance. It may preserve the memory of a world in which divine presence changes its form, while humanity learns to live beneath a heaven that still watches, without always speaking. Your mind drifts across southern Mesopotamia before catastrophe becomes part of anyone's memory. The land appears almost impossibly flat beneath a vast sky, broken by canals, reed beds, villages, and rising temple platforms. Water determines everything here. It carries life into fields, turns dry soil dark, and allows communities to survive where rainfall alone remains unreliable. Along the lower Tigris and Euphrates, people learn to guide rivers through channels, embankments, basins, and carefully maintained irrigation works. That achievement transforms the landscape. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, settlements such as Uruk have grown into extraordinary urban centres. Archaeological work connected with institutions including the University of Chicago and Oxford University has helped reconstruct this remarkable transformation. Excavations reveal monumental buildings, administrative tablets, workshops, storage areas, and systems of organised labour on an impressive scale. The city does not simply happen, it is managed. Grain arrives from surrounding fields, herds are counted, workers receive measured rations, clay tablets preserve quantities, names, duties, and transactions. The city begins to think through records. You walk through an imagined street as morning heat gathers against mud brick walls. A donkey complains somewhere nearby. Basket makers bend reeds into useful shapes while potters turn damp clay beneath practiced hands. A baker works beside an oven, and the smell of grain mixes with smoke, wool, sweat, river water, and animal dung. Nothing feels abstract. Civilization is being built from ordinary labour. At the centre of this world stands the temple. Its importance is difficult to exaggerate. Temples control land, store agricultural produce, employ workers, support crafts, and organise offerings for the divine patrons of each city. Uruk honours powerful deities connected with the city's identity and prosperities. It reveres its own divine protector. Eridu, one of the oldest important settlements in southern Mesopotamia, becomes closely associated with the wisdom god who governs fresh water and hidden knowledge. People do not imagine every city as spiritually interchangeable. Each place belongs within a sacred geography. A city's god is not merely a decoration carved above a doorway. The deity stands at the invisible centre of political, agricultural, and social life. When crops flourish, divine favour may be credited. When disease spreads, a god may be angry. When an enemy army approaches, priests and rulers seek signs concerning what heaven intends. Human government and divine government overlap. Kingship itself eventually becomes something humans describe as descending from heaven. The famous Sumerian king list preserves this idea in a later literary form, placing rulers within an enormous sequence stretching across legendary time. Its earliest reigns are fantastically long. Some kings are said to rule for tens of thousands of years. No modern historian accepts those numbers as ordinary historical chronology. Yet their exaggeration reveals something important about how ancient scribes imagined the distant past. The earliest age was different. Time itself seems larger. Kings are not merely political officials within those stories. They belong to a sacred order established when divine authority and human settlement appear closely connected. This is where a quirky detail enters the picture. Some later readers have treated those enormous reign lengths as hidden mathematical codes, astronomical cycles, or evidence for forgotten superhuman rulers. Such interpretations remain far outside mainstream scholarship. Most specialists instead examine the numbers as literary, symbolic, or ideological constructions shaped by scribal tradition. Still, the enormous figures create a peculiar atmosphere. They make the earliest world feel less ordinary. You begin to sense why ancient Mesopotamians could imagine history as a series of ages rather than one continuous human experience. The land itself encourages that feeling. Rivers shift, channels dry, settlements move. Floods bury floors beneath layers of silt, while new buildings rise over old foundations. A family may live above generations it cannot see. An entire district can disappear beneath later construction. The ground becomes ephemeral. Archaeologists working at sites across Iraq have uncovered this layered reality with remarkable care. Rooms are rebuilt repeatedly, walls are patched, streets change direction, and temples expand across centuries. One sacred structure may stand above several earlier versions occupying nearly the same place. The effect is almost geological. Religion accumulates in layers. A worshipper entering a temple courtyard might not know how many older buildings lie beneath their feet. Yet the location itself carries authority because generations have already treated it as sacred. That continuity gives the gods a physical address within human life. Offerings are delivered. Songs are performed. Incense rises. Animals are presented. Precious objects enter storerooms. Priests wash, dress, and tend cult images representing divine presence within carefully controlled spaces. The relationship is practical as well as reverent. Gods require houses. Their houses require workers. Workers require food. Fields require water. Water requires canals. Canals require coordinated labour. A sacred economy takes shape from that chain. Researchers at Yale University have examined administrative texts showing how closely institutions, agriculture, and labour become connected in early Mesopotamian society. The surviving tablets are often wonderfully unromantic. They mention barley, wool, beer, livestock, workers, and deliveries with relentless precision. Ancient administration can be surprisingly sleepy. Someone somewhere always seems to be counting grain, yet those quiet records reveal a civilization organizing enormous amounts of human effort. They also show how temples function as living institutions rather than mysterious ceremonial ruins. You can imagine workers assembling near a storehouse while officials check quantities against clay records. A seal is pressed into damp clay. A jar is moved. A ration is measured. Behind these ordinary movements stands an extraordinary belief. The city belongs within a divine order. Scholars continue debating exactly how temple institutions and political authority developed during the rise of early Mesopotamian cities. Some emphasize centralized religious institutions. Others argue that economic and political power was more distributed, complicated, and changeable than older models suggested. The evidence rarely allows a single neat picture. That uncertainty matters because ancient cities were living communities, not diagrams. Merchants pursued profit. Families protected property. Officials competed for influence. Priests guarded ritual traditions. Farmers worried about water. Craft workers depended on supplies. Rulers sought legitimacy. No single institution controlled every moment. Even so, divine language surrounds much of public life. A ruler builds because a god commands him. A canal is dedicated to a deity. A military victory demonstrates divine support. A temple renovation becomes an act of cosmic maintenance. You begin to see a society where the boundary between sacred and practical barely exists. A broken canal threatens crops, taxation, social order, and religious obligations at the same time. A poor harvest can become an economic crisis and a spiritual warning. A successful rebuilding project can restore both infrastructure and divine favour. As evening settles, the heat loosens its grip. You feel cooler air moving above the canals. Frogs call from shallow water while insects circle near lamps. Families gather on rooftops where the night breeze offers relief. From the temple precinct, music may carry across the darkening settlement. The gods feel close because their houses dominate the skyline. Their names are spoken in contracts, prayers, hymns, royal inscriptions, and personal names. Their festivals reshape the calendar. Their possessions fill storerooms. Their authority organizes the imagination. And beneath all this activity rests a quiet assumption. Human life has a place within a larger system. Fields, cities, rulers, workers, temples, and gods remain connected through obligations that must continually be maintained. Nothing is permanent by accident. Order requires work. A canal silts up unless someone clears it. A wall collapses unless someone repairs it. A temple loses grandeur unless another generation rebuilds it. Even divine order demands human hands. Perhaps that is the most revealing feature of this ancient landscape. The gods may possess immense power, but civilization still depends upon people carrying baskets, shaping bricks, measuring grain, and opening channels beneath the sun. The sacred world is astonishingly physical. It smells of wet clay. It sounds like tools striking earth. It feels rough beneath the fingers. And within that dense network of labour, worship, authority, and water, humanity appears not as an accidental presence, but as a necessary participant in the maintenance of the ordered world. The scent of warm bread hangs beneath the temple roof as a morning begins across the city. You hear grain being poured into baskets, sandals scraping stone, and wooden doors opening towards storerooms filled with carefully measured supplies. Human beings are busy everywhere. That detail becomes important because Mesopotamian creation traditions often imagine humanity through the language of work. People are not simply placed into the world to admire it. They are given responsibilities. Several surviving texts describe humans as beings who take over burdens once associated with divine labors. The idea may sound strange at first, yet within the social world of ancient Mesopotamia, it possesses an almost uncomfortable logic. Someone must dig canals. Someone must raise belly. Someone must prepare offerings, repair walls, manage animals, and keep divine households functioning properly. Creation in these trees has administration attached. The gods may shape humanity, but apparently nobody escapes paperwork forever. Later Akkadian composition preserved this concept especially clearly. In one famous tradition, lesser gods perform exhausting labour until they rebel against the burden placed upon them. They dig waterways and maintain the ordered landscape, but eventually their patience collapses. The divine community then seeks another solution. Humanity becomes that solution. Scholars at Yale University and the University of Chicago have studied these texts alongside Sumerian compositions that express related ideas about labour and divine service. The precise stories differ, but a recurring pattern remains visible. Human beings occupy a working position inside the sacred order. You can picture the meaning from inside an ancient household. Work begins early because heat makes the middle of the day difficult. A woman grinds grain while children carry small containers. Men move tools toward fields and canals. Animals need feeding. Water must be lifted, transported, or guided. Textiles require endless hours of spinning and weaving. Nothing happens automatically. The economy depends upon repeated physical effort. That reality shapes religious Nidbetin. If even kings depend upon workers, why should the cosmic world require no labour at all? Ancient people often describe heaven using structures familiar from human society. There are rulers, servants, messengers, assemblies, estates, possessions, and assigned responsibilities. The divine world possesses rank. Some gods command, others perform specialized functions. Humanity enters this system near the working end. A temple hymn may praise divine generosity, yet administrative records reveal how much material support religious institutions consume. Bread is baked, beer is brewed, animals are raised, oil is prepared, garments are produced, precious objects are repaired or replaced, musicians perform, priests complete complex routines according to established custom. To modern ears, feeding a divine statue can seem purely symbolic. To worshippers, the ritual expresses a genuine relationship between the human community and its divine owners. The god receives proper care because proper care maintains order. This creates a striking reversal. Humans depend upon gods for fertility, protection, and stability. Yet gods, within ritual practice, receive food and service through human hands. Neither side appears entirely detached from the other. There is obligation in both directions. The arrangement resembles a household expanded until it reaches the scale of the cosmos. You serve because heaven sustains. Heaven sustains because service continues. That circular logic can feel almost comforting. It can also feel slightly unsettling. What happens when humans fail their assigned role? Researchers at Oxford University have explored how Mesopotamian religious texts frame human vulnerability through service, dependence, and divine judgment. The surviving material does not support one simple theology shared across every century or city. Beliefs change. Stories contradict one another. A hymn may emphasize divine kindness, while another composition portrays the gods as unpredictable or distant. That variation is essential. Ancient Mesopotamia lasts for thousands of years. Its religion develops across languages, kingdoms, political systems, and local traditions. There is no single priest explaining everything from one official handbook. History is rarely so tidy. Still, the idea of humanity as a labouring creation appears often enough to deserve careful attention. One particularly curious tradition describes people emerging through divine craftsmanship involving clay and a sacrificed divine being. The details vary according to the composition. Clay provides something earthly. Divine substance provides something more mysterious. Human beings therefore become mixed creatures, formed from ordinary matter but carrying an element linked with the gods. This image has inspired countless fringe interpretations. Some modern writers have treated the language as evidence of ancient genetic engineering performed by technologically advanced visitors. Mainstream historians do not accept that reading. Nothing in the tablets requires laboratories, machines, or biological experimentation in the modern scientific sense. The imagery fits far more naturally within ancient religious ideas about clay, blood, life, and divine agency. Yet the fringe interpretation remains popular because it transforms metaphor into machinery. There is something almost irresistible about doing that. A mysterious ancient sentence appears, and modern imagination immediately installs equipment. The older idea is stranger in a quieter way. Humanity may be valuable precisely because humanity can work. Your hands matter. Your hunger matters. Your ability to cultivate, build, cook, weave, carry, count, and remember becomes part of sacred existence. This differs sharply from later philosophical traditions that separate spiritual worth from physical labour. In Mesopotamian thought, bodily effort can belong directly to cosmic purpose. The worker carrying grain is not standing outside of a religion. The labour itself helps maintain the god's household. Even ordinary economic activity can become sacred through relationship. Archaeological records from major temple centres support the enormous scale of institutional labour. Thousands of our tablets document rations, personnel, livestock, textiles, grain, and organised production. Some workers receive barley and wool according to the status and task. Others belong to teams supervised by administrators whose names survive only because someone recorded an allocation. These are not legendary kings. They are ordinary people caught briefly in clay. A woman may appear because she receives grain. A worker may survive because he owes labour. A child may enter the record through a ration list. Their lives are nearly invisible, yet the system depends upon them. Scholars continue debating how literally religious creation stories should be connected with actual systems of labour and political control. Some interpret these myths partly as reflections of institutional society. Others warn against reducing religious narratives to disguised economic propaganda. Both approaches recognise that mythology and lived experience constantly influence one another. The debate remains open because stories can serve several purposes simultaneously. A creation myth can explain existence. It can justify hierarchy. It can express anxiety. It can also preserve memories of how work feels when people believe the universe itself demands it. You feel rough rope against your palms. A basket presses into your shoulder. Dust clings to damp skin while the sun climbs above the walls. Nearby, an official checks a tablet. Farther away, a temple gate stands open beneath painted decoration. From inside comes the smell of cooked meat and incense. The god receives a meal prepared by human hands. Perhaps you wonder whether the people serving believe they were created specifically for this purpose. Some probably do. Others may simply follow inherited customs because everyone around them does the same. Ancient belief is not uniform inside every mind. Private doubt leaves fewer traces than public ritual. What survives most clearly is the structure. Human life is imagined within obligation. Existence carries duties. The gods are powerful, but human activity remains necessary to the functioning of civilization and worship. Perhaps that is why these stories feel so intimate despite their enormous cosmic scale. They do not ask only where humanity comes from. They ask what humanity is for. And the answer offered by many Mesopotamian traditions is neither heroic nor especially flattering. You are here to work, maintain, feed, build, and serve, yet inside that demanding role lies an unexpected dignity. The divine world requires human hands. In your ears, the city changes first through sound. Grinding stones rasp against grain, hammers strike wood, children call across courtyards, animals cry from pens while merchants bargain near crowded streets. Human life grows louder. That simple observation becomes strangely important in one of Mesopotamia's most unsettling explanations for divine anger. A later Akkadian flood tradition describes humanity multiplying until its noise troubles the kins. The complaint is not framed as a grand rebellion. There is no single wicked king challenging heaven. There is simply too much human activity, too many voices, too little silence. The best-known version appears in the ancient composition often called the Epic of Atrahasis. Copies survive from the second millennium before the Common Era, although the traditions behind them may reach further into Mesopotamian storytelling. Scholars from Oxford University, Yale University, and other major research institutions have examined how this text connects population, labour, divine authority, and catastrophe. Its explanation is extraordinary because the offence seems almost ordinary. Human beings increase in number. Their collective noise becomes unbearable. The senior god responsible for maintaining order cannot sleep. At first, the response is not a flood. Divine punishment arrives gradually. Disease strikes the population. When humanity survives, another measure follows. Drought threatens the land. Rain fails, fields weaken, and hunger begins to tighten around communities dependent upon harvest cycles. You can imagine the atmosphere without needing dramatic spectacle. The sky remains empty. Canals shrink. Dust settles where water should move. Mothers measure food more carefully. Storehouse doors become objects of anxiety. Then, according to the story, humanity continues. The problem refuses to disappear. The divine world reacts again. This sequence has attracted enormous scholarly attention because it resembles a controlled attempt to reduce human numbers before resorting to total destruction. The gods appear less like distant symbols and more like rulers confronting a population they believe has exceeded acceptable limits. The language of noise remains central. What exactly does that noise mean? Scholars disagree. Some read it quite literally as the disturbance produced by a rapidly growing human population. Crowded settlements are rarely quiet. Animals, tools, maquettes, ceremonies, workshops, arguments, and celebrations create a constant human presence. Others interpret the noise more symbolically. It may represent disorder, rebellion, overpopulation, or the burden humanity places upon the divine system. The surviving text never gives modern readers a convenient explanation. That uncertainty is part of its power. You find yourself wondering whether the gods are disturbed by sound itself or by what sound represents. Noise means people. People mean needs. Needs mean pressure upon land, water, food, institutions, and divine attention. The louder humanity becomes, the more visible its demands become. Modern archaeological research provides an interesting background for that ancient anxiety. During periods of urban expansion, southern Mesopotamian settlements grew substantially, drawing larger populations into increasingly organized environments. Researchers connected with the University of Chicago have mapped ancient settlement patterns showing major changes in population concentration across the Mesopotamian plain. Cities could become densely occupied centers surrounded by networks of fields, canals, villages, and dependent communities. Urban success produces its own problems. Water must be distributed fairly. Fields must remain fertile. Canals need maintenance. Food must reach people who no longer grow everything themselves. Disease travels more easily where populations concentrate. Political disputes become larger because more people depend upon the same systems. Ancient storytellers did not describe population pressure using modern demographic language. They gave it a voice. They called it noise. There is something elegant about that choice. Imagine a god listening from above here. One household makes little sound. 10,000 households become thunder. The story turns population into something heaven can physically experience. Humanity is no longer merely present. Humanity is intrusive. A curious fringe interpretation sometimes claims that the complaint about noise records literal, technological interference, perhaps from machinery or unknown ancient devices. There is no archaeological evidence supporting such ideas. The explanation belongs more comfortably within the social and literary world of Mesopotamian mythology. Yet even without exotic machines, the passage remains peculiar enough. A civilization capable of constructing enormous cities also preserves a myth warning that too many humans can become a problem for the powers governing existence. That tension feels surprisingly recognizable. Prosperity creates growth. Growth creates pressure. Pressure creates fear that the system cannot continue forever. For ancient farmers, environmental limits were never theoretical. A field could become less productive. A canal could fail. Salts could accumulate in heavily irrigated soil. A sequence of poor harvests could turn abundance into hunger with frightening speed. Research published through major scientific institutions has shown how environmental change, river behavior, and agricultural stress repeatedly influenced Mesopotamian societies. None of this proves that the Atrahasis story encodes one particular ecological crisis. That remains debated. Still, the myth emerges from a world where resources are visibly finite. People living beside unpredictable rivers understand that order is fragile. Perhaps divine intolerance reflects that fragility. Perhaps the gods become literary guardians of limits. When humans exceed those limits, punishment restores balance. The idea is harsh. It's also strangely bureaucratic. Disease fails. Drought fails. Another restriction is attempted. Each measure resembles an administrative correction applied to a population that refuses to become manageable. The gods do not appear united emotionally. Some divine figures show sympathy toward humanity. Others prioritize collective decree. This disagreement gives the story moral tension. If every god desired destruction equally, the tale would become simple. Instead, divine society contains competing loyalties. Some powers defend order. Others protect the humans who depend upon them. The result is an unstable heaven governing an equally unstable earth. You can almost hear the divine assembly debating beneath a roof of stars. One voice complains that humanity has become intolerable. Another hesitates. Someone proposes restraint. Someone else demands stronger action. Meanwhile, below them, ordinary people continue living. They cook. They sleep. They argue. They have children. They repair walls. They celebrate Mehis Gisir. So, none of them knows their collective existence has become a heavenly problem. That may be the most disturbing element in the story. Individuals do not necessarily understand the charge against them. There is no courtroom. No messenger announces that humanity has become too loud. Punishment descends upon communities whose supposed offence is simply participation in human life. Open scholarly debate continues around how audiences in ancient Mesopotamia understood these episodes. Some researchers emphasize theological questions concerning divine justice. Others see reflections of political authority, where rulers manage populations through decrees, labour, rationing, and punishment. Another interpretation considers the myth as an exploration of mortality itself. If humanity multiplies without limit, death becomes necessary to preserve balance. The story eventually introduces lasting controls upon population, including mortality and social conditions that prevent unlimited human increase. Here mythology begins explaining why life contains boundaries. You feel night settle over the crowded city. Cooking fires dim slowly. Voices soften behind walls. A final cart creaks along the street. Somewhere, a baby begins crying. The sound travels farther now because most other noises have faded. Above the rooftops, the stars remain cold and numerous. Perhaps heaven is listening. Perhaps that is how an ancient audience experiences the tale. Not as a story about evil humanity, but as a story about humanity becoming impossible to ignore. People multiply until their existence reaches the gods as sound. Their presence becomes pressure. Their survival becomes a question debated elsewhere. And in that uncomfortable idea, the flood begins to feel less like sudden anger and more like the final decision of a divine order that has already tried to make the human world quieter. The room in your imagination is quiet enough to hear robes shift against stone. No thunder announces the gathering. No blazing weapon hangs above the assembly. Instead, the gods meet as rulers might meet, seated within an ordered council where decisions carry consequences far beyond the chamber. This image appears repeatedly across Mesopotamian literature. Divine beings do not all alone. They gather. They debate. They approve decrees. They assign destinies. The universe, at least in these stories, possesses something disturbingly close to administration. For humanity, that becomes dangerous when collective judgment turns towards destruction. In the Atrahasis tradition, the senior gods eventually move beyond limited punishments and choose a flood. The decision is not presented as a casual impulse. It becomes a decree. That distinction matters because a decree has structure. A decree binds those who accept the authority behind it. Even a sympathetic god may hesitate to break it openly. You can imagine the atmosphere around such a divine council. Incense rises somewhere beyond carved doors. Oil lamps tremble in the still air. Messengers wait outside. Inside, powerful beings consider the fate of people who cannot hear the conversation. This scene would have felt familiar to ancient audiences. Human kings also governed through councils, officials, proclamations, and formal decisions. Mesopotamian political life depended heavily upon hierarchy. Authority passed through layers. Commands moved downward. Reports moved upward. A farmer might never speak directly to the ruler whose policies shaped his life. Ancient storytellers extended that distance into heaven. The gods become rulers on a scale large enough to govern existence itself. Research associated with the University of Chicago and Yale University has examined how Mesopotamian divine assemblies reflect political and social structures known from ancient cities. The resemblance should not be taken too mechanically. Religion is not simply politics wearing ceremonial clothing. Yet the language of council and decree allows people to imagine cosmic power through institutions they already understand. A heavenly decision feels absolute because earthly decisions often feel absolute too. One god stands above others in authority. Another serves as messenger. Another possesses specialized knowledge. Another may disagree while remaining unable to overturn the collective will. This creates tension inside the divine world. The gods are powerful, but power is distributed. Authority has rules. Even heaven contains procedure. There is something almost comforting about that. There is also something frightening. A storm can be survived. A bad harvest can be endured. But how do you argue with a decision already approved by the structure governing reality? The flood decree transforms natural disaster into judgment. Water will not merely rise. It will carry intention. That idea gives the catastrophe a different emotional weight. The people below continue with ordinary routines while their future becomes a matter of divine policy. A baker shapes dough. A shepherd counts animals. A child sleeps beside a courtyard wall. Somewhere far beyond human hearing, their continued existence has become negotiable. Mesopotamian literature rarely gives modern readers a comfortable picture of divine justice. The gods can be protective. They can also be unpredictable. Human beings seek favor precisely because security never feels guaranteed. A ritual neglected might bring consequences. A divine offense may remain unknown. A city can lose protection because its god has turned away. The ancient religious world contains devotion, but also uncertainty. Scholars continue to debate whether flood narratives should be read mainly as theology, political reflection, environmental memory, or literary exploration of mortality. No single explanation exhausts the material. The divine council may represent all of these concerns at once, A political audience could recognize the danger of distant decisions. A religious audience could recognize human dependence. A farming audience could recognize the terror of water becoming uncontrollable. A storyteller could recognize the dramatic power of placing mercy and law in conflict. That conflict becomes especially important because not every god appears equally enthusiastic about destruction. The wisdom god associated with fresh water, craft, intelligence, and cunning often becomes humanity's quiet protector. He does not simply overturn the divine decree, he works around it. That detail reveals something subtle about the divine order. Compassion may exist inside the system without possessing final authority. A god can care and still be constrained. Perhaps that is why the story remains so haunting. There is no simple villain. One divine power demands order, another protects life. The catastrophe emerges from a system in which different divine priorities collide. Humanity exists below those competing priorities. A curious fringe interpretation sometimes imagines the Divine Council as a literal gathering of advanced non-human rulers managing an ancient human population. This idea has become popular in modern speculative literature. Mainstream historians find no evidence requiring such a reading. The Divine Assembly fits naturally within the religious imagination of Mesopotamia, where heavenly institutions mirror familiar structures of authority. Still, the fringe interpretation survives because the ancient texts describe the gods with remarkably human political behavior. They disagree. They negotiate. They issue commands. They conceal intentions. To modern ears, that can sound less like distant mythology and more like a meeting held behind closed doors. The stranger truth may be simpler. Ancient people understood power through people who made decisions. So divine power also became personal, social, and political. You feel the coolness of a stone threshold beneath your feet. Beyond it, no mortal is allowed. The discussion continues somewhere inside. Perhaps voices. Perhaps they remain controlled. The surviving literary traditions offer only pieces of the emotional atmosphere. What matters is the result. The decision becomes collective. A flood will erase the human population. This does not mean the gods cease caring about the world. Quite the opposite. They seem determined to preserve order, even at terrible cost. That may be the most difficult thought contained within the story. Destruction is not imagined as chaos defeating heaven. Destruction is authorized by heaven. The system itself chooses catastrophe. From a theological perspective, this creates a profound problem. If the gods depend upon human offerings and service, why destroy the very beings who maintain their temples? The story seems aware of this contradiction. Later episodes reveal divine regret and hunger when human offerings disappear. The gods discover that eliminating humanity creates another crisis. Their solution damages their own world. Ancient storytellers appear perfectly willing to portray divine judgment as flawed. That feature separates these gods from later ideas of perfect, all-knowing divinity. Mesopotamian deities possess immense power, yet they can misjudge consequences. They can become angry. They can panic. They can regret. They can disagree over what should have been done. A divine council may therefore possess authority without possessing perfect wisdom. That is a very human kind of heaven. It also explains why cunning becomes so important. When law becomes destructive, survival depends upon finding a path through the law without openly breaking it. The sympathetic deity cannot simply shout a warning in the marketplace. The decree must remain formally intact. The solution requires indirection. Ancient legal culture helps make this logic understandable. Mesopotamian societies recorded contracts, obligations, property transfers, loans, marriages, and court decisions with impressive care. Words matter. Promises matter. Form matters. A clever solution may depend upon how a command is phrased rather than whether it exists. The divine world follows a similar literary logic. A promise can bind a god. An oath can constrain action. A decree may be obeyed in appearance while its purpose is quietly undermined. You begin to understand why the coming catastrophe contains secrecy at its centre. The council's decision creates two realities. In one reality, the gods have chosen destruction. In the other, a path to survival is already forming inside the cracks of divine agreement. The human population knows neither truth. For them, the sky still looks ordinary. The rivers remain within their banks. Markets and/or continue running up. Fields still need tending. The silence of heaven becomes dangerous because silence hides procedure. Nothing appears changed. Yet everything has changed. A decision has been made somewhere beyond human reach. Perhaps that is the deepest unease in the Divine Council scene. The catastrophe does not begin when rain starts falling. It begins when powerful beings agree that humanity may be removed. The flood is only execution. The real turning point happens in silence. A rough wall stands between you and a voice that should not be speaking. The surface is ordinary mud brick, cool in the night air and slightly uneven beneath your fingertips. Beyond it, nothing moves. Then the silence breaks. The wisdom god Enki chooses not to address the man before him in the ordinary way. Instead, he speaks toward the wall. The strange device appears in Mesopotamian flood tradition as a way of preserving the letter of a divine restriction while quietly defeating its purpose. A warning is forbidden. A wall is not forbidden. So the god speaks to an object while a human listener happens to hear every word. It is one of those ancient literary moments that feels almost mischievous. Divine law has discovered a loophole. The man standing nearby is Yusudra in the Sumerian tradition, while later Akkadian versions place a related survivor figure within a fuller narrative. Names shift across centuries, languages, and scribal schools. The underlying tension remains. A powerful god wishes to save humanity without openly declaring rebellion against the Divine Council. The solution depends upon indirect speech. You can imagine Yusudra leaning closer. He hears instructions concerning destruction, preparation, and survival. The wall becomes more than architecture. For a few breathless moments, it becomes the boundary between official silence and forbidden knowledge. Scholars at Oxford University and the University of Chicago have long examined the literary relationship between the Sumerian flood material and later Akkadian composition. The surviving texts do not preserve every line, and damaged passages create uncertainty about exact wording. Even so, the pattern of secret communication is clear enough to reveal a sophisticated narrative problem. The god must protect a mortal. He must also preserve his position within divine order. Ancient audiences would have recognized the value of clever speech. Mesopotamian literature repeatedly admires wisdom that works through language, strategy, and careful interpretation. Strength matters. So does intelligence. A blunt hero breaks a door. A clever god notices that nobody prohibited speaking to the doorframe. There is gentle humour hiding inside the theology. Enki is especially suited to such behaviour. He is associated with wisdom, fresh water, craftsmanship, ritual knowledge, and cunning intelligence. His power often appears through understanding rather than brute force. He knows how systems work. More importantly, he knows where systems bend. In literary traditions, this makes him a natural protector when rigid authority becomes dangerous. You hear the voice continuing through the barrier. The warning cannot remain vague. Survival requires action. A vessel must be prepared. Materials must be gathered. The ordinary rhythms of life must suddenly be interrupted by a secret project whose purpose cannot easily be explained. The listener receives knowledge that separates him from everyone around him. That separation is psychologically important. Once Ziusudra understands what is coming, he inhabits a different world from his neighbours. They see weather. He sees a deadline. They hear routine activity. He hears time narrowing. Knowledge becomes both gift and burden. A scholarly debate remains open concerning how much of this motif belonged to the earliest recoverable Sumerian form and how much developed through later literary elaboration. The damaged nature of the oldest tablet prevents complete certainty. Researchers must compare vocabulary, narrative sequence, parallel traditions, and later copies without pretending that every gap can be restored confidently. The missing lines resist neat reconstruction. Ancient literature often survives this way, not as a complete voice, but as a conversation with absence. You are forced to listen around what has been lost. That incompleteness has encouraged fringe interpretations. Some modern writers claim the wall was not symbolic architecture at all, but a disguised communication device used by technologically advanced beings. There is no archaeological evidence supporting such a claim. Mud brick walls were among the most ordinary features of Mesopotamian architecture. The literary explanation is already strange enough without adding machinery. The god speaks indirectly because indirect speech solves a narrative and theological problem. Yet the technological interpretation reveals something curious about modern readers. Whenever ancient texts describe hidden voices, secret knowledge, or unusual divine behaviour, modern imagination tends to translate mystery into equipment. The ancients usually needed no such translation. For them, divine intelligence could be mysterious on its own. The wall also carries a subtle symbolic quality. Walls protect, walls divide, walls conceal. They create privacy inside crowded cities where households stand close together. A conversation held behind one wall may remain unknown only a few steps away. This makes the image perfect for a secret intended to survive among people who must not hear it. You can almost smell the damp clay. A small lamp burns nearby. Its flame bends whenever air slips through the doorway. Outside, someone passes along the street, unaware that the future of human life is being whispered within arm's reach. The scene remains intimate. No crowd gathers. No priest announces a revelation. No king receives a public sign in the sky. One man listens beside construction material. That quietness changes the meaning of divine communication. The most important message in the world arrives privately. Perhaps this reflects an older human fear. What if truth is not equally distributed? What if survival depends upon hearing something of the never hear? Mesopotamian society already understood restricted knowledge. Scribes possessed literacy that most people did not. Priests knew rituals unavailable to ordinary households. Diviners interpreted signs requiring years of training. Royal courts held information far from public view. Knowledge and authority often travelled together. A secret divine warning therefore fits naturally within a culture where access itself could define status. Ziusudra becomes exceptional not because he is physically stronger than everyone else. He becomes exceptional because he receives information. That is a quieter kind of chosenness. It can also be more unsettling. The divine council controls the decree. Enki controls knowledge of the decree. The mortal controls what he does with that knowledge. Power moves downward through information. This creates a chain of dependence more delicate than any weapon. If the message is misunderstood, humanity disappears. If the secret spreads too openly, divine opposition may intervene. If preparation begins too late, knowledge becomes useless. Wisdom therefore requires timing. You sense why Enki's role is more than simple kindness. He does not merely pity humanity. He engineers survival within constraints. The act is almost legalistic. He obeys the surface of the command while violating its intended outcome. Historians sometimes describe such episodes as examples of divine conflict within a polytheistic system, where different gods embody competing interests without one absolute will erasing every disagreement. That structure allows stories to explore moral ambiguity. A decree may be legitimate and still be disastrous. An act of disobedience may preserve life. A god may remain loyal to heaven while quietly betraying its decision. Nothing is perfectly clean. That complexity gives the scene its enduring powers. You stand again beside the wall. The voice fades. The room returns to stillness. No visible god remains. Only instructions remain. Ziusudra now carries something heavier than fear. He carries a secret that must become action. The wall has done its work. It has allowed heaven to speak without officially speaking, and it has transformed one mortal into the keeper of knowledge that the rest of humanity does not possess. Sometimes the most dangerous words are whispered to nobody, and sometimes somebody is listening. The first sound is not thunder. It is wood being measured. You hear the scrape of tools, the thud of heavy materials, and the low murmur of workers who do not know why the project must be completed so quickly. Ziusudra has received knowledge that separates him from everyone nearby. Now knowledge must become structure. A warning cannot float. It needs walls, beams, fastenings, storage space, and enough strength to survive something no ordinary vessel is built to endure. The surviving Sumerian tablet does not give you a perfect construction manual. Much of the relevant passage is damaged. Lines disappear. Words are broken. The ancient clay preserves enough to establish preparation for catastrophe, but not enough to satisfy every modern question about the vessel itself. That uncertainty is unusually important, and yet you are left watching a king prepare for destruction through fragments. One moment, he receives divine instruction. Another moment, the text has vanished into damage. Then the story continues with the flood already approaching. The missing space invites imagination, but responsible history has to move carefully. Scholars at the University of Pennsylvania and Oxford University have studied how the Sumerian flood narrative relates to later Mesopotamian versions containing much fuller descriptions of boat construction. Those later texts describe dimensions, compartments, waterproofing materials, supplies, animals, craftsmen, and family members with remarkable attention to details. The older Sumerian account remains more restrained because so much of it is lost. You feel the roughness of timber beneath your palm. Wood is valuable in southern Mesopotamia. The river plain provides enormous quantities of reeds, mud, bitumen, and clay, but large structural timbers often come from distant regions. A major vessel therefore represents more than labour. It represents access to resources. Ropes must be prepared. Joints must hold. Seams must resist water. Containers must store grain and liquids. The whole project requires organisation. A ruler is well placed for such work. He commands people. He has access to craftsmen. He can gather materials without explaining every decision to everyone involved. That practical advantage may help explain why flood survivors in Mesopotamian tradition are often socially important figures rather than isolated farmers. Authority becomes part of survival. You can picture men carrying bundles toward the construction area while the heat rises. Carpenters examine joints. Labourers drag heavy materials across packed earth. Someone complains about the weight. Someone else asks why the work must continue through the hottest hours. No answer satisfies them. The vessel grows anyway. A curious feature of later Mesopotamian flood accounts is that the survivor must provide a misleading explanation for his preparations. He tells the people around him that he has lost favour with one god and must depart. The story creates a second layer of concealment. Not only is the divine warning secret, The human response must also remain disguised. This detail does not survive clearly enough in the damaged Sumerian tablet to prove that the earliest version contained the same scene. Scholars continue debating how much narrative material the older composition shared with later versions. Some similarities may preserve very ancient tradition. Other details may have been expanded by generations of scribes. The uncertainty prevents a simple reconstruction. You are not allowed to pretend the missing clay is still there. That restraint can make the story more haunting. What does Ziusudra tell his household? Does he explain everything? Does he explain everything? Does he speak only to trusted workers? Does he conceal the purpose until the vessel is nearly finished? The tablet does not answer. Silence surrounds the practical human consequences of divine knowledge. Imagine possessing certainty about a disaster that nobody else can verify. You cannot point towards dark clouds because the sky may still be clear. You cannot display evidence because the evidence is a whispered command. You cannot easily explain urgency without revealing the secret. So you build. That may be the loneliest part of the preparation. The danger is still invisible. Only the response can be seen. Ancient audiences would have understood how suspicious such behavior might appear. Large construction consumes resources. Workers expect reasons. Officials keep accounts. Families ask questions. A ruler who suddenly redirects labour toward an enormous vessel creates curiosity. Yet ritual and royal authority can also shelter unusual decisions. Kings build temples, canals, walls, ceremonial boats, and storage facilities. A strange project may not immediately reveal its true purpose. This ambiguity gives the story room to breathe. One fringe theory claims that the flood vessel described in Mesopotamian tradition was actually some form of advanced survival technology preserved through misunderstood terminology. There is no archaeological support for this idea. Known Mesopotamian construction methods already provide a plausible cultural framework for large watercraft, especially using reeds, wood, rope, and bitumen. Bitumen is particularly important. Natural deposits of this dark waterproof substance were widely used across ancient Mesopotamia. Builders applied it to boats, walls, floors, baskets, and other surfaces needing protection from moisture. Its smell would have been unmistakable. You can almost sense it now. Heavy, oily, sharp beneath the hotter air. Workers spread the substance across seams while their hands darken. The vessel begins to smell less like timber and more like river work. Archaeology confirms that boats were central to Mesopotamian transportation. Rivers and canals carried people, grains, animals, building materials, and trade goods across the landscape. Researchers connected with the University of Chicago have documented how waterways functioned as essential arteries for settlement and commerce. A flood vessel therefore grows from familiar technology, even if its legendary scale becomes extraordinary. The story does not invent water travel. It enlarges it into soil. Then comes another question. Who exactly is meant to survive? Later versions provide fuller passenger lists. Family members enter. Craftsmen enter. Animals enter. Seeds and supplies are preserved here. The surviving Sumerian text suggests the preservation of life, but its damaged lines make precise reconstruction difficult. This gap has produced extensive scholarly discussion. Some researchers emphasize the continuity of human society. Others focus on the preservation of agricultural life and kingship. The vessel may represent more than rescue. It may represent a portable version of civilization. You cannot rebuild a world with one person alone. You need food, skills, animals, seeds, tools, memory. Perhaps that is why the flood story is not only about scales. It is about continuity under impossible conditions. A vessel becomes an archive made from wood and pitch. Instead of storing words, it stores life. That image carries quiet power. Cities may disappear. Fields may vanish. Temples may fall. But a small enclosed space can carry enough of the old world to begin again somewhere else. The work continues. Containers are moved inside. Ropes are tightened. Food is stacked away from damp surfaces. Animals shift nervously in unfamiliar confinement. People whisper more often now. Even without explanation, urgency has a way of becoming visible. Perhaps workers notice the ruler looking toward the sky. Perhaps they sense that ordinary construction rules no longer apply. The atmosphere changes long before the weather does. You run your hand across the finished surface. It is rough beneath the bitumen. Nothing about it feels divine. It is built from ordinary materials shaped by tired people. And yet the fate of human continuity now depends upon whether those materials hold. That contrast is almost painfully simple. The gods issue decrees. Humans tighten ropes. The heavens decide. Hands respond. Somewhere within that gap lies the entire meaning of preparation. Ziusudra cannot stop the waters. He cannot persuade the divine assembly. He cannot guarantee that the vessel will survive. He can only act on knowledge that others do not possess. So the structure stands beside the river, dark with waterproofing, heavy with supplies, and surrounded by questions. The sky remains open above it. For now, the world still appears ordinary, but the vessel already contains the shape of a world that expects everything else to disappear. Rain begins as a sound against wood. At first, you hear separate drops striking the vessel, irregular and almost harmless. Then the rhythm thickens. Water drums across the roof while wind presses against the walls with growing force. Outside, the familiar landscape disappears beneath darkness. Mesopotamian flood traditions describe the catastrophe as something larger than ordinary seasonal flooding. Storm, wind, rain, and rising water combine until the boundaries of the known world seem to dissolve. In the Sumerian account, the storm lasts for 7 days and 7 nights. The number gives the disaster a ritual rhythm. You do not simply endure bad weather. You pass through a measured period in which ordinary human time seems suspended. Researchers at Oxford University and Yale University have examined how numbers in Mesopotamian literature can carry symbolic weight beyond simple counting. 7 often marks completeness or a meaningful cycle. That does not mean every appearance of 7 must be interpreted identically. Still, its presence gives the flood a strangely ordered shape. Even catastrophe has duration. You are enclosed now. Outside, there's only sound. The vessel groans as waves strike its side. Ropes tighten. Wood complains under pressure. Containers knock against one another in the darkness. Animals shift nervously, sensing movement they cannot understand. Someone whispers. Someone else tries to calm a frightened child. The smell inside grows heavy. Wet wood mixes with bitumen, grain, animals, oil smoke, sweat, and damp clothing. The air becomes close. Every breath reminds you that survival is not comfortable. It is crowded. The world beyond the hull has become invisible. That invisibility matters. A person watching a river rise can still measure danger against familiar landmarks. A wall disappears. A tree vanishes. A rooftop becomes an island. Inside a sealed vessel, those reference points are gone. You hear destruction without seeing its boundaries. The mind supplies what the eyes cannot. Perhaps that is why flood stories remain so psychologically powerful. Water removes orientation. Roads disappear. Property lines vanish. Fields become indistinguishable from streets. A river no longer stays where memory placed it. The landscape loses names because landmarks cease to exist. Ancient Mesopotamians understood this danger intimately. The rivers supporting life across the plain could also change course, break embankments, and inundate settlements. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at several sites, although they do not represent one single event occurring everywhere at the same moment. Researchers connected with the University of Pennsylvania have studied the varied archaeological layers associated with flooding in ancient settlements. The evidence points toward repeated regional disasters rather than one easily identified universal catastrophe. That distinction remains central to scholarly debate. Some historians see Mesopotamian flood literature as shaped partly by memories of severe local inundations. Others emphasize literary tradition, theology, and the symbolic destruction of social order. The story can preserve environmental memory without functioning as a precise weather report. You feel the vessel tilt, a container slides. Hands reach for it immediately. Every object now matters because there is nowhere to replace what is lost. A cracked jar becomes serious. A broken rope becomes dangerous. A small leak becomes terrifying. This is survival reduced to maintenance. You are not defeating the storm. You are keeping failure away one task at a time. That detail gives the scene an almost domestic quality. Someone checks food. Someone tends an animal. Someone empties collected water. Someone watches the seams. Civilization is contracted into a handful of repeated actions inside darkness. The outside world may be collapsing, but inside of the vessel, people still organize themselves. That contrast carries enormous symbolic weight. Order survives inside enclosure. Chaos rules outside. Ancient storytellers often imagine cosmic stability through boundaries. Land must remain separated from water. Cities must remain protected by walls. Temples establish controlled sacred space. Households depend upon doors, courtyards, and roofs. The flood attacks these distinctions. Water crosses everything. It ignores borders. It erases human organization. The vessel becomes the final surviving boundary. Inside is memory. Outside is dissolute. A curious fringe theory claims the 7 days and nights encode an astronomical event or a forgotten planetary disturbance. There is no reliable evidence supporting such conclusions. Ancient literature often uses structured numbers for rhythm, symbolism, and narrative emphasis. The 7-day duration works naturally within that literary world. Still, the number creates peculiar calm within the terror. The catastrophe is not endless. Somewhere beyond the darkness, time continues counting. 1 day passes. Then another. You cannot see the sun clearly, but the body still senses exhaustion. Sleep comes in fragments. Every sudden movement wakes someone. Every change in the wind sounds meaningful. Perhaps the storm is weakening. Perhaps it is becoming worse. Inside confinement, hope becomes cautious. You stop trusting silence. A quiet moment may mean relief. It may also mean something outside it has changed in a way you cannot understand. The Sumerian tradition describes overwhelming wind and storm sweeping across the land. Later Mesopotamian accounts intensify the imagery until even divine beings react with fear. The disaster becomes so terrible that the gods themselves recoil from what has been unleashed. That image introduces an unexpected reversal. The beings who authorize destruction do not remain emotionally untouched by it. Power does not guarantee comfort with consequences. Scholars continue discussing whether such passages criticize divine decision-making or simply dramatize the overwhelming scale of the flood. The distinction cannot be settled easily. Mesopotamian gods are capable of regret without becoming powerless. They can make terrible choices while remaining worthy of worship. Ancient theology often tolerates contradictions that modern readers try to resolve. Perhaps worship does not require believing the gods are always gentle. Perhaps it requires accepting that divine power is larger than human expectations of fairness. You listen as another wave strikes. For a moment, everything leans. Then the vessel rights itself. A frightened animal cries from somewhere nearby. Nobody laughs. The darkness presses close. 7 nights can feel longer when each one may be your last, yet the vessel remains intact. That fact becomes almost miraculous through repetition. It survives. Then another. Then another. No heroic battle occurs. No monster appears. Survival consists of endurance. The quieter truth is that catastrophe often feels exactly like that. People do not spend every moment performing great deeds. They wait. They listen. They conserve food. They comfort one another. They try not to imagine what has disappeared. Somewhere beneath the water may lie fields where grain once moved in the wind. Courtyards may already be filled with silt. Kilns may be cold. Storehouses may have collapsed. Roads may exist only in memory. You cannot know. That uncertainty may be worse than seeing destruction directly. A person who sees ruins understands what has happened. A person enclosed in darkness imagines everything. Perhaps this is why the vessel had become such a powerful literary space. It's both refuge and prison. It preserves life while cutting survivors away from the world that gave their lives meaning. No one knows whether land remains. No one knows whether the storm has covered one region or everything imaginable. Ancient geography places no comforting modern map inside the cabin. There are no reports arriving from distant cities. No messenger can travel. The survivors possess only sound, motion, and belief. The 7th night arrives. The wind still moves across the waters, but something changes within its voice. The force begins to break. Rain no longer pounds with the same relentless weight. Between gusts, you hear intervals of quiet. At first, nobody trusts them. Then the intervals lengthen. The vessel still rises and falls, but the violence loosens. You place your hand against the wall. For the first time in days, it is possible to hear individual drops again. The world has not returned. Nothing familiar waits outside, but the storm has begun surrendering its hold. In the darkness, that small change is enough. A thin blade of light enters the darkness. At first, you barely trust it. Your eyes have grown accustomed to dim interiors, damp surfaces, and the uncertain movement beneath your feet. Then the brightness strengthens. According to the surviving Sumerian flood account, the sun god appears when the great storm has finally passed. Ziusudra opens an opening in the enormous vessel, and sunlight enters the enclosed space. The moment is simple. That simplicity gives it extraordinary weight. Light touches faces that have lived for days without knowing whether the world still exists beyond the walls. Dust floats through the beam. Moisture glitters on wood. Someone raises a hand toward the brightness almost without thinking. The sun has returned. Yet returning sunlight does not mean the old world has returned with it. You move toward the opening and look outside. Water stretches farther than Haurug's. Backs. The ordinary geometry of settlement has vanished. No field boundary guides the eye. No road or schism. Hurricane offers direction. Canals and river channels have lost their familiar shapes beneath a broad shining surface. The landscape seems unfinished. Ancient Mesopotamian flood stories often describe survival as emerging into a world where recognizable order has been erased. This is not merely relief after danger. It is disorientation. You have survived, but survival has placed you somewhere that no longer matches the map inside your mind. The sun warms your face. For the first time, You notice how cold the damp air inside the vessel has become. Outside, the smell is different. There is water, wet earth, broken vegetation, and the shawl's sharp odour of exposed mud. A familiar plain has become strangely morose. Southern Mesopotamia was always shaped by water. Yet water normally belonged within channels, marshes, canals, and rivers that humans could name and use. Now it seems to possess everything. Researchers from the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania have reconstructed how dramatically river courses changed across the ancient Mesopotamian plains. Settlements could flourish beside one channel and later find themselves stranded when water shifted elsewhere. Entire communities depended upon landscapes that were never completely stable. That historical fact helps explain why flood traditions feel so deeply rooted in place. The ground beneath the civilization could change. A river could abandon one route and create another. Fields could become marsh. Marsh could become dry ground. The world was dependable only temporarily. You look again toward the horizon. Perhaps pieces of timber float nearby. Perhaps reeds lie flattened beneath the water. Perhaps distant shapes suggest rooftops or trees. The text does not give you a detailed inventory of ruin. That absence leaves the landscape almost more unsettling. There is no list of destroyed neighborhoods. No census of the missing. The story allows emptiness to speak. Silence now has a different quality. During the storm, silence was rare and suspicious. Here, silence becomes vast. No marketplace calls. No grinding stones. No animals from neighbouring pens. No voices drift from courtyards. The world has lost its ordinary background sound. You hear only water touching the vessel. A bird may call somewhere far away. The sound feels feels enormous. This moment creates one of the deepest emotional questions in flood mythology. What does survival mean when the world that gave survival meaning has disappeared? Ancient literature does not always linger on trauma in the way modern writing might. Instead, it gives you gestures. An opening is made. Light enters. An offering is prepared. A survivor bus. Action carries emotion. In the Sumerian accounts, Yasudra sacrifices an ox and a sheep. The gesture reconnects human life with divine order at the first possible moment. That detail is historically significant. Animal sacrifice and food offerings formed important parts of Mesopotamian religious practice, although rituals varied across periods and cities. Scholars at Yale University have examined how offerings created relationships of service, gratitude, obligation, and communication between worshippers and gods. The survivor does not respond to sunlight by declaring independence from heaven. He worships. That may seem surprising. The same divine world that allowed destruction has preserved him, and his first public response is reverence. Ancient religion rarely follows modern expectations of emotional consistency. Fear and devotion can coexist. Gratitude does not erase terror. A worshipper may depend upon powers that remain dangerous. Perhaps that is exactly why worship becomes urgent. A curious modern fringe theory claims that the returning sun in flood traditions records an ancient atmospheric clearing after a planetary catastrophe caused by a celestial collision. No reliable archaeological or astronomical evidence supports such a reconstruction. The scene requires no hidden planet to make sense. After prolonged darkness and storm, moonlight naturally becomes the most powerful possible symbol of renewed order. Still, the speculation reveals how strongly people want the sun's return to mean more than weather. Ancient storytellers wanted that too. Light marks transition. The storm belongs to confusion. The sun belongs to structure. Day can be counted again. Direction will become visible. Colors return. Human beings can once more distinguish Earth from sky, yet the question of the actual flood behind these stories remains open. Archaeologists have discovered substantial flood deposits at ancient Mesopotamian sites including Shuruppak, Ur, and Kish, but these layers differ in date and local context. They do not demonstrate one simultaneous inundation covering the entire ancient world. Researchers debate whether memories of several destructive floods gradually contributed to a shared literary tradition. Some argue that one particularly severe regional event may have left an enduring cultural memories. Others emphasize that myths can gather material from repeated disasters across many generations. The clay does not choose for you. It preserves memory in a form that is neither simple history nor meaningless invention. You stand within that uncertainty. The sunlight rises higher. Water changes from grey to bronze. Then it brightens towards silver beneath the growing day. Perhaps distant patches of land begin to show. Perhaps they are only debris. You cannot yet tell. Human eyes search naturally for familiar shapes. A tree line? A wall? A hill? Anything that says the world still possesses structure. There is something quietly cruel about recognizing a landscape through what is missing. You know where a settlement should be because nothing stands there. You know where fields once stretched because water now reflects the sky. Absence becomes a form of geography. The survivor must somehow understand that the catastrophe has divided existence into two categories. Things remembered. Things remaining. The difference cannot yet be measured. There are no scribes walking through ruined streets to count losses. There are no messengers bringing reports. Memory alone holds the vanished world. Perhaps names are spoken quietly inside the vessel. A district, a temple, a relative, a field, a doorway. Each word preserves something the eye can no longer confirm. This is how catastrophe becomes tradition. People tell what they cannot restore. They repeat names because repetition prevents complete disappearance. They describe the waters because the waters explain why familiar places are gone. A story begins growing around absence. For a moment, it feels as though even the sun is examining what remains. Its light reveals without comforting. Nothing can hide now. The darkness has ended, but daylight exposes the scale of emptiness. That may be why the Sumerian image of the sun god entering the scene feels so powerful. Light does not reverse destruction. It simply makes survival visible. Ziusudra bows. Smoke from sacrifice rises into open air. The scent of burning meat drifts across the wet landscape, carrying the first deliberate human signal into a world that seems emptied of ordinary life. Someone is still here. Someone still remembers the gods. Someone still knows how to perform the old gestures. The waters may have erased roads, houses, fields, and boundaries, but they have not erased ritual knowledge. Civilization survives first as memory and action. The sun continues climbing. Its warmth settles across soaked wood. Water glitters in every direction. And beneath that calm brightness, you begin to understand the strange loneliness of survival. The storm has stopped threatening life. Now emptiness asks what life will become. Smoke rises slowly into the clean morning air. The offering fire crackles beside the vessel, and the scent of roasted meat mingles with wet earth and river mud. Ziusudra lowers himself in reverence. His gestures deliberate, almost formal, as though the old rules of worship still matter despite everything that has happened. The surviving Sumerian account now reaches one of its most remarkable moments. The great gods appear. An and Enlil acknowledge the survivor, and Ziusudra receives reward unlike anything granted to an ordinary king. They give him life like that of a god. They establish him in a distant land, a place associated with sunrise and divine favour. Humanity has survived through one man, yet the survivor does not simply return to the ordinary world. He is removed from it. That detail changes the atmosphere completely. If the purpose were merely to celebrate survival, Ziusudra could rebuild his city, reclaim his throne, and become the ancestor of renewed civilization. Instead, the text carries him somewhere remote. The man who crossed the destruction becomes separated from ordinary human existence. Immortality is granted, but it comes with distance. You can imagine the moment quietly. The waters still shine beneath the sun. The earth smells raw and newly exposed. Ziusudra kneels while divine figures stand somewhere beyond ordinary sight, their presence transforming the empty landscape into sacred ground. No cheering crowd surrounds him. No city celebrates his return. His reward is almost piyut. Researchers at Oxford University and Yale University have studied the unusual place of immortal flood survivors within Mesopotamian literature. The traditions vary, yet a recognizable pattern emerges. The survivor is not simply fortunate. He becomes exceptional in a way that separates him permanently from ordinary humanity. That distinction matters because immortality is rare in Mesopotamian thought. Kings may claim divine favor. Heroes may possess extraordinary strength. Priests may approach sacred spaces unavailable to others. Yet death remains the normal condition of human beings. Even great rulers eventually descend into the realm of the dead. Ziusudra crosses that boundary without dying. His reward therefore creates a theological puzzle. Why preserve one human only to remove him from common human life? Perhaps the answer lies in what he represents. He is not merely an individual. He becomes a living witness. The divine decision to preserve him establishes continuity without restoring the old relationship exactly as it was. He survives the catastrophe, yet his exceptional status cannot simply be shared. The privilege remains contained. This is where the story begins to feel more unsettling than triumphant. The gods have accepted a human survivor. They have accepted sacrifice. They have restored communication. But they do not reopen the world exactly as it once existed. A boundary has appeared. You sense it in the geography. The place assigned to Ziusudra lies far away. Later traditions imagine the immortal flood survivor living beyond the ordinary reach of kings and travellers. He exists somewhere at the edge of the known world, accessible only through extraordinary effort. Immortality becomes geographically isolated. That is a curious idea. A human may possess eternal life, but ordinary humans cannot simply visit him whenever they wish. The gift remains chill and unreachable. A fringe interpretation popular among some modern writers treats this distant homeland as a memory of a hidden, technological refuge controlled by advanced beings. There is no archaeological evidence for such a conclusion. Ancient literature regularly places extraordinary beings and sacred locations beyond familiar geography. Distance expresses difference. A remote land can function symbolically without corresponding to a secret physical installation. The ancient imagination does not require machinery to create inaccessible worlds. Sometimes a far horizon's enough. The more interesting mystery lies in why distance becomes necessary at all. Mesopotamian religion often imagines divine presence through controlled access. Temple sanctuaries have restricted spaces. Sacred objects receive careful treatment. Priests follow specialized procedures. Kings may approach places ordinary people cannot. Closeness to the divine is rarely casual. It is regulated. Ziusudra's fate fits that pattern on an enormous scale. He becomes close to the gods precisely by becoming distant from everyone else. You can almost feel the paradox. He is honoured. He is also removed. He gains endless life. He loses ordinary human belonging. Perhaps immortality is not a simple reward. Perhaps it is another kind of separation. Scholars continue debating how the Sumerian description of Ziusudra's destination should be interpreted. Some emphasize connections with sacred geography and eastern lands associated with sunrise. Others examine linguistic uncertainties created by damaged lines and later textual parallels. The surviving evidence allows several possibilities without offering complete certainty. That scholarly caution is important. Ancient place names can carry religious meaning that does not map neatly onto modern geography. A location may be real, symbolic, mythological, or all three at once. You stand mentally at the edge of such a landscape. The eastern horizon glows with pale gold. Reeds bend under a light wind. Somewhere beyond familiar settlements, the survivor is imagined continuing to live. His existence becomes proof that the gods did not erase everything. Yet it also becomes proof that ordinary humanity cannot return to the same closeness. The relationship has changed. This shift appears quietly. There is no proclamation announcing that divine contact will now operate differently. Instead, narrative structure reveals it. A chosen person receives special knowledge. A chosen person survives. A chosen person receives extraordinary access. Everyone else dies, and else remains outside that privilege. Divine communication becomes selective. That selectivity will become deeply characteristic of Mesopotamian religious culture. Kings receive dreams. Priests interpret signs. Diviners read unusual events. Prophetic figures sometimes deliver messages. Ordinary worshippers pray through established rituals. The gods remain active, but their presence is filtered. You rarely find a simple world where everyone speaks directly with divine beings whenever questions arise. Access depends upon circumstance, status, ritual, and interpretation. The flood survivor stands almost like an early symbol of that controlled access. He knows more because he was told more. He survives because he knows more. Then he's placed farther away because his knowledge and status no longer belong comfortably within ordinary human society. Researchers at the University of Chicago have emphasized how strongly Mesopotamian religion depends upon mediation. Temples, priests, omens, rituals, and royal authority create channels through which divine intention becomes understandable. The gods are not absent. They are difficult to approach correctly. That difference can shape an entire civilization. If divine presence is immediate, people respond to presence. If divine presence is hidden, people develop methods for interpretation. The sacred world becomes something to read. A dream may matter. A strange birth may matter. The flight of birds may matter. A pattern in smoke may matter. The heavens themselves may become a form of writing. The flood story does not explain all these practices directly. Still, Ziusudra's reward belongs within the same cultural logic. Divine closeness is possible. It is simply exceptional. You hear the offering fire settling into embers. The bright flames have become red points beneath grey ash. The ritual is almost finished. Ziusudra has done what survivors often do in ancient stories. He has acknowledged the powers that remain larger than himself. The gods, in turn, acknowledge him. There is reconciliation but not restoration. The distinction is subtle. A relationship can continue without returning to its former shape. Perhaps that is what the ancient story understands with unusual clarity. Catastrophe changes relationships even when both sides survive. Trust changes. Distance changes. Rules change. The world may still contain the same gods and the same human beings, yet the space between them can become wider. Ziusudra receives the greatest possible sign of divine favour. He is allowed to live beyond ordinary human limits. And still the gift carries him away from humanity. The gods have accepted the survivor. They have not restored familiarity. They remain present, powerful, and attentive. But closeness has become rare. A dream settles over the sleeping king like a second darkness. He lies beneath a roof of cedar beams while an oil lamp fades nearby. Outside, guards remain awake beside the palace gate, listening to distant dogs and the soft movement of night wind. Nothing enters the room. No divine figure crosses the threshold in ordinary daylight. Yet by morning, the king may believe heaven has spoken. This quieter form of contact becomes deeply characteristic of Mesopotamian religious life. Gods remain powerful, active, and capable of intervention, but their intentions often arrive through carefully restricted channels. Dreams become one of those channels. Some are dismissed as ordinary products of sleep. Others are treated as possible messages requiring interpretation. A ruler who receives a troubling vision may consult specialists trained to distinguish meaningful signs from meaningless confusion. The difference matters. A dream might concern war. It might warn of illness, and it might justify construction, pilgrimage, ritual purification, or a political decision. Divine speech has not vanished. It has become harder to recognize. You can imagine waking with an image still clinging to your mind. A river flows backward. A bright star falls. A stranger hands you a sealed object. The room around you looks ordinary, yet the dream refuses to dissolve. Was it merely sleep, or did something speak? Mesopotamian scholars approached such uncertainty with remarkable seriousness. Collections of dream omens were assembled over generations, preserving interpretations associated with particular images and circumstances. Researchers at Yale University and the University of Chicago have studied these extensive divinatory traditions as evidence for a culture deeply concerned with reading divine intention. The practice was not random guessing. Specialists inherited technical knowledge. They consulted written traditions. They compared unusual events with established patterns. Their work formed part of an intellectual system that could require long training. You begin to see how divine distance creates human expertise. When a god does not stand visibly in the courtyard, someone must learn to interpret traces. That person gains authority. Priests and diviners become mediators between hidden intention and public action. A king may command armies, but he still needs help understanding what heaven thinks of the campaign. This arrangement gives uncertainty a structure. An eclipse is not merely frightening. It can be classified. A strange animal birth can be recorded. A dream can be compared with other dreams. A storm arriving at an unusual moment may enter a larger framework of meaning. The world becomes full of possible messages. Even silence can contain information. One major Mesopotamian divinatory practice involves examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The organ is studied carefully for unusual shapes, marks, divisions, and features. Modern readers sometimes find this practice bizarre. For ancient specialists, it belongs to an organized method of seeking divine judgment. Archaeologists have discovered clay models of livers marked with regions used for instruction. Some survive with labels indicating how particular features should be understood. Students could therefore study an artificial model before handling the real organ. There is something unexpectedly familiar about the method. A trainee learns from a teaching model. The subject just happens to be a sheep's liver used to question the seers. The practice shows how seriously hidden communication was treated. A ruler considering military action might seek confirmation through divination. A dangerous omen could delay decisions. A favourable reading might strengthen confidence. Divine approval becomes political information. That relationship between religion and government is supported by extensive cuneiform evidence from royal courts. Scholars at Oxford University have examined letters and scholarly reports sent to Mesopotamian kings concerning celestial observations and ominous events. These documents reveal learned specialists reporting what they saw and explaining what those signs might mean. The heavens had become something like an enormous text. Stars formed patterns. Planets moved according to recognizable cycles. The moon changed appearance. Eclipses disrupted expected order. Each irregularity invited interpretation. Human beings looked upward because direct speech from the divine world could not always be expected. This does not mean Mesopotamians believed every event carried a message. Their scholarly traditions could be selective and technically sophisticated, yet the possibility of meaning remained close. You step onto a palace terrace in the cool hours before sunrise. An observer watches the eastern sky. He notes the position of a planet near the horizon. Another scholar records the appearance of the moon. Their work is quiet.
No ceremony surrounds every observation.
Still, royal security may depend upon what they conclude. A strange fringe idea claims these omen traditions preserve memories of forgotten scientific communication with non-human intelligences. Some enthusiasts argue that celestial observation began because ancient people were waiting for signals from beings associated with the sky. There is no reliable evidence supporting that interpretation. The surviving tablets show human scholars building traditions from observation, classification, analogy, and inherited religious assumptions. Their achievements need no hidden instructors. The reality is already impressive. They watched the sky for generations. They recorded. They compared. They remembered. Knowledge accumulated. Divine silence may therefore have produced an unexpected intellectual consequence. The less obvious the message, the more carefully people watched. A visible God requires recognition. An invisible God requires interpretation. That difference encourages system. Dream books grow. Omen collections expand. Specialists organize signs into categories. Royal archives preserve reports. The world becomes intellectually dense because uncertainty must be managed. Yet scholars continue debating how ancient Mesopotamians understood the relationship between omen and divine causation. Some researchers emphasize that an omen was regarded as a direct warning deliberately produced by a god. Others argue that learned divination sometimes treated signs more like established correlations within an ordered cosmos. The distinction remains open because surviving texts reflect different periods, schools, and intellectual environments. Ancient thought does not always fit neatly into modern categories of religion and science. To the people practicing these methods, observing nature and seeking divine meaning could belong to the same act. There was no need to separate them sharply. A star could be physical and a dream could be psychological and sacred. An animal could possess ordinary anatomy while also presenting a divine sign. The categories overlap. That overlap helps explain why silence does not create absence. The gods remain embedded within the environment. Their communication has simply become indirect. This also changes human responsibility. If messages require interpretation, mistakes become possible. A diviner may misunderstand. A king may ignore advice. A priest may select the wrong ritual response. The distance between divine intention and human action fills with uncertainty. You can sense the anxiety created by that gap. Suppose an eclipse occurs. Is it dangerous for the king? Does it concern another region? Can ritual action reduce the threat? Should a substitute ruler temporarily occupy the throne to absorb the omen's danger? Mesopotamian courts sometimes employed exactly such extraordinary protective measures. A temporary substitute could be installed when omens threatened the real monarch. The practice reveals how seriously celestial warnings might be taken. It also produces one of history's stranger political arrangements. For a brief period, the throne may hold someone whose purpose is not to rule well, but to stand where danger is expected to fall. Divine communication has become procedural. Signs are received, experts interpret them, ritual specialists respond, political action follows. The god may remain unseen through the entire process, yet the unseen presence influences decisions across the kingdom. You hear the soft scratch of a reed stylus across clay. A scholar records what he observed in the sky. Another checks an older tablet. A priest prepares a response. The king waits. No thunder speaks from the ceiling. No divine hand appears. Still, an entire chain of human activity moves because heaven might have sent a message. Perhaps this is what sacred distance truly means. The gods do not need to disappear to become silent. They only need to stop speaking in ways everyone can recognize. Then humanity begins listening differently. Eyes turn towards stars. Dreams become evidence. Unusual events acquire weight. Priests learn patterns. Kings depend upon interpreters. The divine world remains powerful precisely because it is difficult to read. And somewhere beneath the vast Mesopotamian sky, you begin to understand how silence can become one of the most influential voices of all. A royal name is pressed into wet clay. Then another follows. And another. The list grows until human memory seems too small to contain it. In Mesopotamian tradition, kingship is not treated as merely a political arrangement invented by ambitious men. It is described as something that descends from heaven. That phrase gives rulership a sacred beginning. A king does not simply control land. He occupies a place within a cosmic structure. The Sumerian king list preserves this idea in one of the most famous sequences of names from ancient Mesopotamia. Several copies survive from different periods, and they do not always agree perfectly. Yet their broad pattern is striking. Cities rise. Kings rule. Dynasties move. Then comes the flood. The text places that catastrophe between two great eras of kingship. The line itself is remarkably brief. The flood sweeps over. Then kingship descends from heaven again. You can almost feel the pause hidden inside those few words. Everything has been broken, yet authority returns. The world does not begin again without structure. It begins again with rulership. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Chicago have studied surviving copies of the king list as both historical evidence and political literature. The document combines rulers who are archaeologically attested with figures whose reign lengths belong clearly to legendary time. This mixture makes the text unusually powerful. History and myth stand beside each other without apology. One king may belong to a recognizable dynasty. Another is assigned a reign lasting thousands of years. The list does not seem embarrassed by the difference. Its purpose is larger than modern chronology. It presents kingship as something ancient, continuous, and divinely authorized. You see a scribe sitting cross-legged beside a low surface. A lump of clay rests in his hand. He presses wedge-shaped signs carefully while another tablet lies nearby for reference. His work seems quiet, yet he's arranging the entire past. Some cities receive long sequences of rulers. Others appear briefly. Power shifts from place to place as though kingship itself travels through the landscape. The city may change. The institution continues. This gives political history a sacred rhythm. A dynasty does not simply conquer another dynasty. Kingship passes. Authority relocates. The pattern makes human politics feel like part of a deeper order. That idea would have been useful to rulers. A king who claims participation in an ancient heavenly institution gains more than military prestige. He gains legitimacy. His throne becomes part of cosmic continuity. The king list therefore deserves caution. It is not a neutral record written only to satisfy future historians. It carries political meaning. Scholars at Oxford University have emphasised that ancient king lists could shape memory as much as preserve it. Some rulers may be omitted. Some dynasties may be arranged in ways supporting particular ideas of legitimate succession. The document creates order from a past that was likely far more complicated. Ancient cities frequently existed at the same time. The king list often presents them as though kingship moves neatly from one centre to another. Reality was rarely so polite. Several rulers could claim authority simultaneously. Cities competed. Territories overlapped. Victory in one region did not erase every rival elsewhere. The text smooths conflict into sequence. That makes it less useful as a simple calendar and more valuable as a window into political imagination. The flood stands at the centre of that imagination like a dark dividing line. As rulers on one side belong to legendary antiquity. Rulers on the other side belong to a world gradually becoming more historically recognisable. The catastrophe separates two kinds of forms, or serious or time. This has inspired a curious fringe theory. Some modern writers claim the enormous reigning lengths of the earliest kings preserve literal memories of beings who lived for thousands of years. Others suggest advanced rulers arrive from somewhere beyond ordinary humanity and govern the earliest cities. Mainstream historians do not accept these interpretations. The numbers are better understood within literary, mathematical, symbolic, and ideological traditions. Even so, the scale of those reigns creates a deliberate sense of distance. The ancient past is not merely earlier, it is different. A ruler living for tens of thousands of years belongs to a world where ordinary measures no longer apply. That helps the flood function as more than disaster. It becomes a threshold. The unbelievable age ends. The more familiar age begins. You can imagine why such a boundary would appeal to scribes. Every society inherits ruins, old names, unexplained traditions, and stories whose origins nobody remembers. The king list arranges those uncertainties into a pattern. There was order. There was catastrophe. Order returned. This pattern does not promise that rulers are always good. It promises that kingship itself survives. That distinction is important. Mesopotamian texts can criticize individual kings. They can describe failed rulers, defeated rulers, arrogant rulers, and rulers abandoned by a divine favour. Yet the institution remains sacred. A throne may lose its occupant. Kingship itself does not disappear. This gives the post-catastrophe world a surprising stability. The gods may seem more distant. Cities may have vanished. Human life may have been reduced to a remnant. Still, political order returns through a mechanism already associated with heaven. The new human world therefore remains connected to divine authority. It is not abandoned. It is governed differently. You walk through an imagined city where walls are rising again. Workers carry baskets of earth. Surveyors mark boundaries. Storehouses begin filling. A ruler receives petitions beneath a shaded entrance. Nothing here resembles a forgotten golden age of immortal kings. The labour is ordinary. The buildings require maintenance. The people age, yet the ruler's office carries a claim older than anyone living. Kingship came from heaven. That phrase stands over the city like an invisible canopy. Scholars continue debating exactly when different forms of the king list were composed and how strongly each version reflects the political goals of particular dynasties. Some researchers emphasize its ideological purpose. Others examine the historical information embedded within its legendary framework. The debate is so open because the text operates on several levels at once. It is memory. It is propaganda. It is theology. It is chronology. It is also a story about continuity. The most important feature may be what the list refuses to imagine. It refuses permanent political emptiness. The flood interrupts kingship, but does not destroy the concept. Authority returns because the world apparently requires it. Someone must judge disputes. Someone must command labour. Someone must maintain canals. Someone must organise defence. Someone must represent the city before its gods. Kingship becomes the bridge between divine order and human administration. That role places rulers in an uncomfortable position. They are not gods in the fullest sense. They are also not ordinary citizens. They stand between. Their inscriptions often present them as chosen, favoured, or commissioned by divine powers. A ruler may claim that a god called his name. Another may say a deity ordered him to build. Another may describe victory as proof of supernatural support. The language creates proximity without equality. The king is close enough to receive divine authority. He is still human enough to die. That balance gives rulership its sacred tension. You hear ceremonial music carrying through a courtyard. A throne stands beneath a canopy. Official? Wait. Scribes hold clay tablets. Petitioners speak carefully. Above them all rises the invisible claim that this institution belongs to a pattern older than any living memory. The flood did not erase it. The catastrophe merely interrupted its earthly expression. Then kingship descended again. Perhaps that sentence reveals something profound about how Mesopotamian scribes understood survival. Civilization does not return simply when people remain alive. Civilization returns when order becomes organized. Names are recorded. Cities are governed. Authority is recognized. Time becomes countable through reigns. The world acquires sequence again. A ruined landscape can contain survivors. A kingdom requires structure. So the list begins once more. A king is named. A city receives authority. Human history resumes under a heaven that still claims ownership of the throne. Cold stone rests beneath your fingertips as you enter the sacred precinct. The city outside remains noisy with carts, merchants, animals, and workers, but the atmosphere changes near the temple doorway. Voices lower. Footsteps become deliberate. The smell of bread gives way to incense, oil, cedar, and warm wax smoke. Somewhere deeper inside, a room is closed to almost everyone. The god is believed to dwell there. Ancient Mesopotamian temples were not simply gathering halls where large crowds assembled for shared worship. They were divine households. The central sanctuary belonged to the deity, and access became increasingly controlled as you moved inward. Courtyards received visitors. Storage rooms held supplies. Workshops supported ritual needs. Administrative chambers managed property. At the sacred centre stood a chamber associated with divine presence. That arrangement reveals something important. The god remains within the city, yet most people do not approach the god directly. Presence has acquired architecture. Walls now regulate closeness. You walk through a gateway decorated with carefully arranged brickwork. A guard may stand nearby. An official checks daily. Workers bring grain, wool, oil, and livestock into institutional spaces connected with the sanctuary. Nothing here feels abandoned. The temple is active. Its activity, however, is highly organized. A sacred building can employ bakers, brewers, musicians, shepherds, craftsmen, administrators, cleaners, and ritual specialists. The divine household requires an entire human workforce. Excavations at cities such as Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu reveal centuries of rebuilding around important sacred locations. Researchers associated with the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania have documented monumental religious complexes built repeatedly over earlier structures. A temple could be enlarged, repaired, abandoned, restored, and rebuilt without losing the sacred identity attached to its location. The building changes. The divine address remains. This continuity helps explain why temple space carries such authority. A worshipper approaching the sanctuary may know that generations have already brought offerings to the same sacred ground. His parents may have prayed there. Their parents may have done the same. Memory becomes physical through repeated constructions. You can sense it beneath your feet. Older walls lie buried below newer walls. Collapsed floors support later chambers. Fragments of offerings remain trapped within foundations. A city literally builds its present worship upon its religious past. Yet the most sacred room may remain invisible to ordinary citizens. Only selected priests enter. This restricted access creates a peculiar form of nearness. The god is close enough to have a house within walking distance. The god is distant enough that most people cannot enter the private chambers. A person may therefore live beside a divine presence without ever seeing its most sacred representation directly. That tension becomes central to temple religion. You hear musicians preparing somewhere beyond a wall. A stringed instrument is tuned. A drum receives a soft testing striking. Ritual specialists wash their hands and arrange garments according to inherited procedure. Food is prepared with care. Drink is measured. Perfume may be applied. The god receives service like an exalted ruler. Texts and archaeological evidence show that cult statues could be treated as living embodiments of divine presence within temple ritual. They were washed, dressed, fed, adorned, entertained, and protected. Scholars at Yale University have examined how such practices created a powerful relationship between material image and invisible deity. The statue was not merely decoration. Within ritual thought, it could become the authorized body through which divine presence inhabited sacred space. This raises an obvious modern question. Did worshippers believe the statue itself was literally the god? The answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Mesopotamian ritual texts suggest that divine images could be transformed through ceremonies that separated them from ordinary human craftsmanship. The object became more than wood, stone, or metal. Yet the deity was never limited entirely to that material form. A god could inhabit heaven, influence nature, appear in dreams, and also dwell within an image. Divine presence could occupy several levels at once. Modern categories struggle with that flexibility. Ancient worshippers seem less bothered. A temple image can be zikrid without imprisoning the god inside it. The scholarly debate remains open over how ordinary worshippers understood this relationship compared with trained priests and royal theologians. Elite ritual texts preserve sophisticated ideas about divine embodiment. Everyday people may have held simpler, different, or more varied beliefs. Their private thoughts rarely survive. Public practice survives more clearly. Offerings continue. Festivals continue. Processions continue. Prayers continue. The god is treated as present. That may tell you more than any surviving theological definition. A curious fringe theory claims that temple sanctuaries were designed as hidden technological chambers where ancient priests communicated with advanced beings. Supporters point to restricted access, unusual architecture, and the authority surrounding sacred objects. Archaeology provides no reliable evidence for such machinery. The restricted spaces fit known religious patterns far more naturally. Sacredness often increases through controlled access. A royal throne room works similarly. The ruler becomes more impressive when only selected people can approach directly. Divine architecture magnifies that principle. Distance creates awe. You pass through another doorway. The air feels cooler here. Light enters through limited openings, leaving corners in shadow. A polished object catches a small flame and reflects it briefly across the wall. The room smells of oil and incense. Someone speaks a prayer quietly. The sacred world is no longer encountered in an open landscape. It is concentrated. A building now gathers divine presence into carefully maintained space. That concentration changes human behavior. People approach with offerings. They request favors. They seek healing. They ask for protection. They dedicate objects after surviving danger. They bring evidence of gratitude. Their relationship with the god becomes increasingly mediated by place and ritual. The temple acts almost like a controlled doorway. You cannot simply walk through every part of it. You cannot touch every object. You cannot perform every ceremony. Specialists protect the boundaries. This gives priests an important social role. They do not merely lead prayers. They maintain conditions under which the divine presence can remain properly housed. Purity matters. Correct words matter. Correct timing matters. A neglected ritual risks more than embarrassment. It may disturb the relationship between city and deity. Temple archives reveal how carefully resources were organized to support this system. Administrative tablets record deliveries of grain, beer, oil, wool, animals, metals, and other goods. Such records confirm that sacred institutions functioned as major economic centers. Researchers from major universities have spent decades reconstructing these systems from thousands of apparently mundane entries. A sheep appears in an account. A jar of oil is delivered. A garment is assigned. Behind those dry details stands a living religious store. Someone must feed the god tomorrow morning. Someone must replace the ceremonial clothing. Someone must prepare music for the festival. The divine presence depends upon continuity of care. This produces a strange reversal. People enter the temple seeking help from a powerful deity. The temple itself depends upon people to maintain the conditions of sacred residence. The god protects the city. The city maintains the god's house. Neither side appears entirely passive. The relationship is reciprocal, even when power remains unequal. You step back into the courtyard. Sunlight feels brighter after the dim interior. Ordinary life resumes around you. A worker carries baskets toward a storeroom. A child waits beside an older relative. A priest disappears through a doorway you cannot enter. Somewhere inside, the divine image remains hidden from most eyes. The god has not vanished. The god has become enclosed. Presence now lives behind walls, rituals, schedules, and guarded thresholds. Perhaps that is one reason sacred architecture becomes so powerful. A closed door can make an unseen presence feel stronger than an open room. You do not need to see what lies beyond it. You only need to believe something important is there. A bronze bowl catches the last light of evening. Beside it, a diviner sits in silence while assistants arrange clay tablets, oil, water, and ritual objects across a low tables. Outside, the city settles gradually. Shutters are sort of closed. Animal, quiet down. The heat loosens from the walls. Inside the chamber, attention becomes sharper. A question has been brought before the gods. No divine figure appears. No voice speaks from the ceiling. Instead, the answer must be discovered through signs. This is one of the strangest developments in Mesopotamian religious life. When divine intentions are difficult to hear directly, specialists learn to search for them everywhere. They watch the sky. They study dreams. They examine animals. They observe smoke, unusual burr. Natural births, illnesses, weather, and unexpected events. Silence becomes something that can be interpreted. That idea may feel unfamiliar, but it grows naturally from the world around you. If a god does not speak plainly, perhaps the god speaks through patterns. If a decision cannot be heard, perhaps it can be read. Mesopotamian diviners become experts in that uncertain territory. Their work is not casual superstition performed only during moments of panic. It develops into an enormous scholarly tradition. Researchers at Yale University and the University of Chicago have examined thousands of surviving omen tablets showing how carefully observations were organized. A sign is recorded. Its possible consequence is recorded beside it. Then similar signs are grouped together. Knowledge accumulates across generations. A diviner does not merely rely upon intuition. He consults precedent. You hear the soft scratch of a reed stylus against damp clay. An older tablet lies open nearby. One line describes an unusual appearance of the moon. Another records the meaning of an unexpected animal birth. Another explains what may happen if oil poured into water forms a certain shape. The system can feel almost endless. That is because almost anything unusual may become meaningful. The world itself has become a page. A particularly important form of divination involves examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The practice may seem peculiar to modern listeners. For Mesopotamian specialists, however, the liver could serve as a structured surface upon which divine intention became visible. Its lobes, marks, shapes, and irregularities were studied carefully. Clay teaching models survive from the ancient Near East, demonstrating that students learned specific anatomical regions and associated interpretations. Some models are covered with inscriptions. A trainee could therefore study before performing an actual ritual consultation. The fact is remarkable. Ancient divination had classroom. You can imagine the student leaning over a clay model while an older specialist points toward one marked region. A mistake here could matter. The question might concern war, succession, rebellion, disease, or the safety of the king. Divination belongs close to power because uncertainty is dangerous for rulers. A commander may possess thousands of soldiers and still hesitate if the omens appear unfavorable. A king may control wealthy cities and still fear an eclipse. Political authority cannot eliminate divine uncertainty. In some ways, it increases it. The more responsibility a ruler possesses, the more consequences a bad decision carries. This helps explain why royal courts employ learned specialists. They observe, they advise, they interpret. Their knowledge offers a way to manage risk in a world where gods remain powerful but rarely provide simple explanations. You notice how carefully everything is arranged. Purity matters. Timing matters. The wording of the question matters. A diviner cannot simply ask whatever enters his mind. Procedure creates control. That control is psychological as well as religious. A frightening uncertainty becomes easier to face when it can be transformed into a ritual sequence. First, prepare, then ask, then observe, then interpret. Human beings create structure around what they cannot know. The practice becomes especially sophisticated in celestial divination. Mesopotamian scholars observe the moon, planets, stars, eclipses, clouds, and unusual atmospheric events with extraordinary patience. The sky changes slowly enough to reward long memory. One generation records, another compares or patterns emerge. Researchers connected with Oxford University have studied royal letters in which scholars report astronomical observations to kings and explain their possible significance. These reports reveal something striking about ancient expertise. The observer may distinguish between what was actually seen and what older omen traditions say it might mean. Observation and interpretation exist together. That combination eventually contributes to important developments in astronomy. The scholars do not begin with modern scientific assumptions. They begin because the heavens matter, yet repeated observation creates increasingly precise knowledges. Divine silence encourages measurement. That's a fascinating irony. The hidden gods may help produce better records of visible natures. You step onto a palace rooftop. The night air carries the faint scent of dust and cooking smoke. A scholar watches the horizon. He knows where certain planets should appear. He knows the expected shape of the moon. He notices when something differs from pattern. The sky is beautiful, he saw. It's beautiful. It is also administrative. Every unusual event may carry consequences for someone below. One eclipse can become a political crisis. Mesopotamian rulers sometimes respond to dangerous celestial omens with elaborate protective rituals. In certain cases, a substitute king may temporarily occupy the throne while the true monarch withdraws from public position. The substitute symbolically receives the danger directed toward kingship. This practice sounds almost theatrical. It was taken very seriously. A man might be placed on the throne precisely because the throne has become dangerous. The arrangement reveals how strongly omens could influence political behaviour. It also produces one of ancient history's more unsettling details. Power itself can become contagious. For a short period, the royal seat is treated almost like a place where danger is expected to land. A fringe theory has grown around these traditions. Some modern enthusiasts claim celestial omens preserve forgotten contact with intelligent beings who deliberately sense signals through astronomical events. There is no reliable evidence supporting such an interpretation. The theory, the surviving material shows ancient scholars using observation, inherited religious ideas, and complex systems of analogy. The reality requires no hidden transmitters. Human beings are already quite capable of finding meaning in the sky. The more interesting question is how those specialists themselves understood causation. Did a god deliberately create each omen as a message? Or did the cosmos contain patterns in which divine will and natural events were already connected? Scholars continue debating this distinction. Some texts strongly suggest intentional warnings from divine powers. Others seem closer to a linear system where particular signs reliably correspond with particular outcomes. Ancient categories do not fit comfortably inside modern divisions between religion and science. A celestial event can be natural and meaningful at the same time. There is no contradiction if the universe itself is sacred. This produces a world dense with interpretation. A dream may become evidence. A storm may become commentary. An animal's body may contain a warning. A planet near the horizon may alter royal plans. Silence has not emptied the world. It has filled the world with possibilities. That abundance creates anxiety. If everything unusual might mean something, people need experts to distinguish dangerous signs from ordinary events. Priests and diviners therefore become guardians of interpretation. They decide which details matter. Their authority grows from ambiguity. You can feel how such a system changes human behaviour. People watch more carefully. They remember unusual events. They compare stories. They ask what happened next. Patterns become traditions because communities keep looking backward for meanings. A strange event today is understood through another event recorded generations earlier. The past becomes a library of diviner behaviours. Clay tablets preserve that library. Fire destroys buildings. Dynasties collapse. Languages change. Yet some omen collections survive because scribes copied them repeatedly. Their continued use proves that interpretation remained important across centuries. A diviner reading an old tablet may be separated from its first author by hundreds of years. Still, he trusts that earlier observation may help explain the present. This is a form of intellectual inheritance. Knowledge outlives the people who gathered it. You return to the quiet chamber. The oil lamp burns lower. The diviner studies Alpine once more. Nothing supernatural becomes visible. The room remains ordinary, yet a decision may soon be arrived because of what he sees. An army may wait. A ritual may begin. A king may change his plans. A city may prepare for danger. The gods do not need to appear in person. A pattern is enough. And perhaps that is the most powerful transformation of all. When heaven grows difficult to hear, humanity does not stop listening. It listens harder. Cool water runs across carved stone hands. A priest works carefully in the half-light, washing the image as though tending a living guest. Another attendant brings cloth. Someone prepares scented oil. A garment is lifted from a chest and arranged with ceremonial precision. The figure itself remains silent. Yet within the sanctuary, silence does not mean emptiness. To the people serving here, the divine images can become a place where presence settles. This is one of the most unusual features of Mesopotamian religion. A statue is shaped by human craftsmen, yet ritual can transform its meaning completely. Wood, stone, gold, and precious materials are assembled by skilled hands. Eyes may be inlaid. Clothing may be prepared. Jewellery may be attached. The finished object looks human enough to invite recognition, but formal ceremony separates it from ordinary craftsmanship. The statue is no longer treated as an attractive object. It becomes sacred. Researchers at Yale University and Oxford University have studied ritual texts describing ceremonies connected with the activation of divine images. These rites could symbolically remove the human craftsman's authorship and establish the statue as a suitable dwelling for divine presence. The theological logic is delicate. Everyone knows somebody carved the image, yet ritual declares that its final identity comes from somewhere beyond the workshop. Human hands make the body. Sacred action changes what that body means. You can imagine the craftsman standing nearby. For weeks, perhaps months, he has shaped the material. He has polished surfaces. He has repaired mistakes. He has watched the face emerge slowly from stone or wood. Then ritual specialists take over. The object he created becomes something he must approach differently. That transformation would have carried enormous emotional weight. The familiar becomes untouchable. The handmade becomes holy. A face once covered in dust now receives offerings. This tension helps explain why divine statues occupied such protected spaces. They were not normally displayed as public decoration in the modern sense. They belonged inside sanctuaries. Access was controlled. Movement was ceremonial. Care was continuous. The statue might receive food several times during the day. It could be dressed in elaborate garments. Jewellery might be changed according to festival or occasion. Music could be performed. Perfume and incense filled the chamber. The deity's household operated according to routine, and routine itself became evidence of presence. You hear bowls being placed carefully on a table. Bread is arranged. Beer is poured. Meat is presented. The doors may then close while the divine meal remains within the sacred chamber. Later, portions can be redistributed among human participants according to established custom. The god does not need to eat like an ordinary person for the ritual to matter. The offering maintains relationship. It confirms that the divine resident is still being served. The practice turns architecture into hospitality. The temple becomes a house. The sanctuary becomes a private room. The statue becomes the most concentrated point of divine residence. A mainstream historical fact supports this picture strongly. Royal inscriptions and administrative records confirm that rulers dedicated valuable resources to divine images, sacred furniture, clothing, and temple maintenance. Kings understood this expenditure as part of legitimate rule. A well-cared-for deity protected the city. A neglected divine household could imply disorder, impiety, or political failure. This means statues stood close to power. To control a sacred image could be politically significant. Enemy armies sometimes removed divine statues from conquered cities. The act was far more serious than stealing treasure. Taking the image could symbolize the removal of the god's protection. A defeated city might interpret the loss as evidence that its deity had departed or allowed captivity. The physical image therefore carried the emotional weight of divine presence and civic identity. You imagine soldiers entering a sanctuary. The room is suddenly exposed to people who do not belong there. Sacred furniture is disturbed. Priests are pushed aside, or the image is lifted. For the citizens outside, this is not merely looting. Their divine protector is leaving the city. The streets remain. The walls remain, but something essential has been removed. Later rulers sometimes celebrated the return of captured divine statues. Restoration could become a major political and religious event. Processions marked the deity's homecoming. Offerings multiplied. Order seemed restored because the god had returned to the proper house. The image was therefore both object and a relationship. Its location mattered. Its treatment mattered. Its visibility mattered. This creates one of the strangest religious possibilities in the ancient world. A god may be everywhere in power while being especially present in one carefully maintained body. The statue becomes a focal point. A person cannot embrace the sun. A person cannot dress a river. A person cannot place food before the night sky. But a statue can be washed, clothed, fed, carried, praised, and protected. Divine presence becomes approachable through material form. Scholars continue debating how literally ordinary Mesopotamians understood that presence. Some specialists emphasize ritual texts suggesting a very strong identification between god and image. Others argue that worshippers probably recognized different levels of symbolic and actual presence depending upon context. The evidence does not allow access to every private belief. A priest may understand sacred embodiment differently from a merchant standing outside the temple gate. A king may emphasize political meaning. A household worshipper may respond emotionally to the image without forming a formal theory. The debate remains open because religious experience rarely fits one definition. A fringe idea sometimes claims that the statues were ancient containers built to house non-human consciousness. Supporters point to rituals that open the eyes and mouth of an image, interpreting them as procedures for activating artificial bodies. There is no archaeological evidence for hidden mechanisms, machinery, or technological consciousness inside these statues. The rites make sense within ancient concepts of sacred transformation, yet the modern theory accidentally notices something genuine. The rituals are concerned with making an image capable of presence. The mistake lies in translating sacred embodiment into modern technology. Ancient people did not need wires to imagine activation. Words, purification, offerings, and divine approval were enough. You stand close to one of these images now. Its eyes seem unusually large. That feature appears on many Mesopotamian votive statues. The effect can feel almost uncomfortable. The figure seems permanently attentive. Some statues placed in temples represented worshippers rather than gods. They could stand with clasped hands and wide eyes, maintaining a posture of devotion even when the human donor was somewhere else. The statue continues watching. It continues waiting. It continues praying through form. Researchers associated with the University of Chicago have examined such votive figures from early Mesopotamian temples. Their exaggerated eyes are often interpreted as signs of alertness, reverence, or perpetual attention toward the divine. A human being must eventually sleep. A stone worshipper does not. That is a wonderfully strange solution to mortality. You place an image in sacred space, and part of your devotion remains there without interruption. The god sees the worshipper. The worshipper's statue sees the god. Looking becomes reciprocal. The sanctuary fills with watching bodies. Some represent divine presence. Others represent human devotion. All remain silent. And still the silence feels crowded. Perhaps that is the real power of these images. They provide shape to relationships that cannot otherwise be seen. A prayer receives a face. A god receives a bod. A worshipper receives a permanent representative. Distance becomes material. Presence becomes visible. Nothing moves. Nothing speaks. Yet the entire room is alive with attention. A small clay figurine rests beneath the floor of an ordinary house. No procession surrounds it. No king knows it exists. The object lies hidden near a doorway, placed there by people who believe unseen forces can cross thresholds as easily as neighbours. This quiet domestic gesture reveals something important about Mesopotamian religion. Divine presence does not belong only to monumental temples. It enters kitchens, bedrooms, workshops, gardens, and family courtyards. A household may live far from a palace sanctuary and still organise daily life around supernatural protection. You wake before sunrise. Someone beside you lights a small lamp. Another person murmurs a prayer before opening the door. The family worries about illness, childbirth, bad dreams, debt, accidents, hostile spirits, and the uncertain favour of powerful gods. Their concerns are intensely ordinary. Religion meets them there. Protective objects can be placed beneath floors or near entrances. Incantations may be spoken against frightening forces. Personal seals carry divine symbols. Names themselves can contain appeals to particular gods. A child may carry a divine name throughout life, turning identity into a quiet statement of dependencies. The gods remain present in language. They remain present in habits. They remain present in fear. Researchers at Yale University and Oxford University have studied thousands of personal names from Mesopotamian records. Many contain references to deities, expressing gratitude, devotion, protection, or requests for favour. A name can say that a god has given life. Another can declare that a deity has protected the family. A third may express confidence that a divine power has heard prayer. These are not grand theological treatises. They are everyday statements carried by living peoples. That evidence makes divine disappearance difficult to imagine. A god who has truly vanished does not remain inside the names of merchants, scribes, children, and soldiers. You can hear those names being called across markets. An official reads one from a tablet. A mother calls another from a courtyard. A witness repeats another during a legal agreement. The divine world enters conversation without requiring ceremonial drama. Even accounting becomes religious by accident. A clerk recording barley may preserve a divine name simply because the worker receiving the barley carries it. Thousands of years later, the name remains pressed into clay. The prayer hidden inside it survives too. Royal inscriptions deepen this picture. Kings repeatedly describe military victories, building projects, and political authority as gifts granted by divine patrons. A ruler does not usually announce that he succeeded because the gods no longer matter. He does the opposite. He claims they selected him. He says they strengthened his weapons. He credits them with granting wisdom to territory or legitimacy. The language is political, but it is also religious. Divine favour becomes part of public authority. Researchers connected with the University of Chicago have examined how royal inscriptions use sacred language to transform political action into cosmic responsibilities. A king repairing a wall may present the work as obedience to a god. A conqueror may claim victory fulfills divine judgment. A canal can become evidence of sacred approval. The ruler's actions are therefore narrated within a world where the gods remain active behind visible events. That activity can be comforting. It can also be dangerous. If victory proves divine favour, defeat may imply divine rejection. Mesopotamian rulers understood that uncomfortable possibility. When cities fall, texts sometimes describe their gods as angry, absent, or temporarily withdrawn. The language does not usually suggest that the deities cease to exist. Instead, their protection has changed. A god may abandon a city. A god may allow an enemy to triumph. A god may later return. Presence becomes conditional. This idea appears strongly in lamentation literature. Ancient poems mourn destroyed cities with extraordinary emotional depth. Walls collapse. Temples become desolate. Families scatter. The city's goddess may be portrayed as grieving over the destruction while remaining unable to prevent the decree. You hear sorrow rather than silence. The deity has not disappeared. She mourns. That detail creates a complex theology. A god can love a city and still fail to save it. Divine beings can suffer with indecisions made by higher powers. Ancient religion does not always demand neat consistency. It allows grief to exist inside heaven. Scholars continue debating how literally these laments reflect specific historical catastrophes compared with later ritual and literary reinterpretation. Some researchers connect particular compositions with known political collapses. Others emphasize their repeated use as ceremonial texts shaped over generations. The open question reminds you that literature can preserve emotional truth even when chronology becomes difficult. A destroyed city needs explanation. A lament provides one. The gods are not gone. Something has broken in the relationship. That interpretation allows worship to continue even after disaster. If the deity no longer existed, prayer would be pointless. If the deity remains but has turned away, reconciliation becomes possible. That difference matters enormously. You sit inside a damaged sanctuary. Dust lies where offerings once stood. A priest sings into the emptiness. The song asks why divine protection failed. It remembers prosperity. It describes abandonment. Then it pleads for restoration. The prayer itself assumes someone is listening. Even complaint becomes proof of belief. Mesopotamian worshippers were not afraid to address divine powers with anxiety, confusion, or frustration. Personal prayers sometimes describe people who believe they have been punished without understanding their offense. A sufferer may insist that known rituals were performed correctly. He may ask what hidden mistake caused divine anger. The uncertainty feels deeply human. You can obey every rule you know and still fear there is another rule nobody told you. Ancient religion offers no simple escape from that anxiety. Instead, it provides language for surviving it. Hymns praise. Laments question. Prayers request mercy. Rituals seek restoration. Each act assumes continued divine attention. Even unanswered prayer keeps the relationship alive. A curious fringe interpretation claims some Mesopotamian protective figurines were miniature representations of forgotten supernatural guardians physically stationed beneath buildings. There is no evidence that such beings literally occupied ancient houses. Archaeology shows that figurines were deliberately deposited as ritual objects intended to protect structures and inhabitants. The practice is unusual enough without turning clay into biology. Imagine someone kneeling during construction. A small figure is placed into a prepared cavity. Words may be spoken. The floor is sealed. Nobody sees the object again. Its power depends partly upon invisibility. The family walks above it for years. Children grow. Meals are cooked. Arguments happen.
Visitors enter.
The figurine remains below, silently performing its protective role within the household imagination. This is religion without spectacle. It does not need a towering monument. A few inches of clay can carry enormous hope. The same principle appears in amulets and protective inscriptions. People wear symbols against danger. They place sacred signs near vulnerable spaces. They invoke powerful names. A god may seem distant from ordinary sight, yet divine protection can be brought close through objects and words. Distance becomes manageable, not eliminated. Managed? That distinction may explain why divine silence never becomes divine absence. The gods remain woven into causation. A healthy child may inspire gratitude. A successful journey may confirm protection. A sudden illness may suggest anger. A fortunate dream may offer reassurance. Ordinary experience becomes readable within sacred expectation. Modern observers may separate coincidence, medicine, weather, politics, and religion into different categories. Mesopotamian thought often allows those categories to overlap. A fever can have physical symptoms and divine meaning. A military defeat can be strategic and sacred. A harvest can depend upon irrigation and divine favour. The world does not divide neatly. That intellectual landscape helps the gods remain everywhere without appearing visibly. You walk through a residential quarter at dusk. Bread cools near one doorway. A merchant seals a storage jar. A woman hangs a protective object near a sleeping child. A scribe finishes a contract containing several names honouring gods. Farther away, temple music reaches the rooftops as a faint pulse. Nothing supernatural steps into the streets. Still, divine presence surrounds ordinary life. It appears in names. It appears in vows. It appears beneath floors. It appears in royal claims, household fears, mourning songs, and private gratitudes. Perhaps disappearance was never the right question. The more useful question is how presence changes when it becomes less visible. A god does not need to stand in front of you to shape your decisions. Belief can work through habits, institutions, language, memory, and expectation. That kind of presence may be quieter. It may also be harder to remove. The gods become distant enough to remain mysterious, yet close enough to occupy every uncertainty. And so the ancient world continues listening for beings who rarely need to appear in order to remain everywhere. A scribe moistens fresh clay and begins copying a story already old in his own lifetime. His reed stylus presses one sign, then another, while afternoon light slips across the tablet's damp surface. The names are changed. The language is changing. Even some details of the disaster are changing. Yet the flood remains. Across many centuries, Mesopotamian scribes preserve related stories of divine destruction and human survival in Sumerian and Akkadian literary traditions. Zeus Adra appears in one version. Trahasis appears in another. Utnapishtim becomes the survivor and countered by Gilgamesh in the great Babylonian epic. They are not simply three spellings of one name. Each belongs to a different literary setting. Still, unmistakable connections bind their stories together. A divine decision threatens humanity. One person receives privileged warning. A vessel preserves life. The waters overwhelm the inhabited world. Sacrifice follows survival. The gods respond. What changes around this structure is just as important as what remains. You can imagine generations of scribes sitting in schoolrooms, palace libraries, and temple complexes. They copy old compositions because literacy requires practice and tradition carries prestige. A teacher recites a line. A student presses it into clay. Another copy appears decades later. Small differences enter. Some are mistakes. Some reflect dialect. Others may be deliberate literary choices. Stories survive by being repeated, and repetition never produces perfect stillness. Researchers at Yale University and Oxford University have compared surviving versions of Mesopotamian flood narratives to reconstruct their complex textual relationships. Their work shows that no single tablet can be treated as the original source of every later version. The traditions develop across long periods of cultural change. That fact matters because ancient memory behaves more like a river than a stone monument. It moves. It divides. It receives as new material. It sometimes returns to an older channel. The Atreides tradition gives one of the fullest explanations for divine frustration with humanity. Population grows. Human noise becomes unbearable. Attempts to reduce human numbers fail. The flood becomes the final measure. The story then addresses a practical problem that follows survival. If humans continue multiplying without limits, the same crisis may return. So lasting boundaries are introduced into human life. Mortality becomes unavoidable. Some births do not succeed. Some people remain outside parenthood. Human population is restrained through permanent conditions rather than repeated annihilation. This is a dark form of compromise. The divine world accepts humanity, but not without limits. You may hear something almost administrative in the solution. Heaven has discovered that total destruction is inefficient. The system is adjusted. Human beings continue existing under new restrictions. That development gives the flood story a deeper purpose than explaining a spectacular disaster. It begins explaining why human life itself contains frustration, death, and incompleteness. The catastrophe becomes an origin story for limitation. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same flood tradition enters a different emotional landscape. Gilgamesh is not preparing for a flood. He is searching for escape from death. His friend has died, and mortality has suddenly become impossible for him to ignore. The king travels toward Utnapishtim because this distant survivor possesses something Gilgamesh desperately wants. He has crossed beyond ordinary human death. The flood story therefore becomes part of a meditation on immortality. Utnapishtim explains how he survived the divine catastrophe and why his exceptional life cannot simply be copied by another man. The lesson is quiet and severe. One human received immortality under extraordinary circumstances. That does not mean immortality has become available to humanity. The exception proves this boundary. Gilgamesh listens to a story of survival only to discover that survival cannot solve his deepest fear. The gods may preserve one person. They do not remove death from everyone. Researchers at the University of Chicago have studied how the Epic of Gilgamesh combines older traditions into a profound exploration of kingship, friendship, grief, and human limitation. The flood episode fits naturally within that larger theme. A catastrophe once threatened all human life. Now one grieving king confronts the catastrophe contained within a single human death. The scale changes. The fear does not. This transformation reveals how ancient storytellers reused inherited material without merely repeating it. A flood account can explain divine anger in one composition. In another, it explains why immortality belongs beyond normal human reach. The same ancient memory carries different philosophical weight depending upon where the storyteller places it. You listen to Utnapishtim speaking from his distant dwelling. His voice is calm because he has already crossed the boundary Gilgamesh fears. He describes the construction of the vessel. He remembers weather. He recalls the reactions of the gods. He remembers releasing birds to search for land. Later Babylonian versions preserve details that are absent or broken in surviving Sumerian material. This does not necessarily mean those details are invented late. Some may descend from traditions preserved in texts now lost. Others may indeed represent literary expansion. Scholars debate exactly how the different flood traditions relate to one another. Was there one early narrative that gradually developed into several forms? Did multiple local flood traditions merge over time? How much did scribes consciously reshape inherited stories for new audiences? The surviving tablets cannot answer every question. Their gaps leave room for several models. That uncertainty is useful. It prevents the story from becoming falsely neat. Ancient literature rarely survives through a single clean line of transmission. Texts disappear. Copies survive accidentally. Libraries burn. Buildings collapse. Tablets break. A version that seems secondary today may preserve a detail older than anything surviving elsewhere. The archaeological record rewards humility. A curious fringe theory claims the differences among flood stories represent separate eyewitness reports of one worldwide disaster. Supporters sometimes compare details from Mesopotamia with flood traditions from distant cultures and assume all must preserve one historical event. Mainstream scholarship remains cautious about such conclusions. Flood myths can emerge independently in societies living near dangerous rivers, coasts, monsoon system, or unpredictable lakes. Stories can also travel through trade, migration, conquest, and literary contact. Similarity alone does not prove a single global catastrophe. The Mesopotamian evidence is more interesting when you allow it to remain historically specific. These stories grow in landscapes where water is essential and dangerous. They are copied by scribes who inherit centuries of religious thought. They are retold under different kingdoms. Each age receives the flood and asks a slightly different question. Why were humans nearly destroyed? Why did one person survive? Why do the gods regret their own decision? Why must humans die? Why can exceptional immortality not become ordinary? The flood becomes a container for changing anxieties. That may explain its remarkable endurance. A story survives when it can answer more than one fear. You sit now beside the imaginary scribe. His tablet is nearly full. He turns it carefully so the wet clay does not smear. Perhaps he does not think of himself as preserving something mysterious. He may simply be copying a respected composition. Yet his work participates in a chain stretching across generation. Another scribe will copy his copy. Another will alter a phrase. Another will preserve a damaged line because he no longer understands it completely. The story continues moving. What survives is not one frozen revelation. It is a conversation across time. That conversation repeatedly returns to the same uneasy relationship between gods and humans. The divine world destroys. The divine world preserves. The divine world regrets. The divine world imposes limits. Humanity survives, but never regains complete security. Perhaps that is why the gods seem both near and distant in these traditions. They remain involved enough to determine human fate, yet their decisions emerge from a realm ordinary people cannot enter. The flood memory therefore grows larger with every retelling. It becomes history, warning, theology, grief, and philosophy at once. The names may change. The clay may change. The questions remain alive. A trench cuts downward through the ruins of an ancient city. You stand beside its edge while sunlight reaches across layers of brick, ash, broken pottery, and compacted earth. Each layer represents time. A wall appears, then disappears beneath another floor. A hearth becomes buried. A doorway is sealed. Then, between ordinary layers of occupation, the soil suddenly changes. There is silt. For archaeologists working in Mesopotamia, such deposits have sometimes raised an irresistible question. Could this be the flood? The question became especially famous during excavations at the ancient city of Ur. In the late 1920s, The British archaeologist Leonard Woolley directed major excavations there and encounter-coloured a thick deposit of clean alluvial material beneath parts of the site. Workers dug through the silt and eventually reached older traces of human occupation below it. To Woolley, the discovery seemed dramatic. A settled community had existed. Then water had covered the area deeply enough to leave a substantial layer. Then people returned. The sequence looked remarkably like catastrophe written into the ground. Reports of the discovery quickly attracted public attention. The temptation was obvious. Ancient tablets described a devastating flood. Now archaeologists had uncovered physical evidence of severe flooding in one of Mesopotamia's most famous cities. For a moment, clay literature and buried sediment seemed to touch. Yet archaeology rarely rewards the first exciting answer. Researchers began comparing the evidence from Ur with deposits at other ancient sites. Flood layers also appeared at places such as Kish and Shuruppak. The problem was timing. They did not all belong to exactly the same period. Some deposits represented different local events. Their depth varied. Their archaeological mechanics differed. The neat picture became complicated. That complication is one of the most important mainstream facts surrounding Mesopotamian flood archaeology. Southern Mesopotamia experienced major floods, but the known archaeological layers do not demonstrate one single inundation covering every settlement at the same moment. Researchers at the University of Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, and Oxford University have contributed to the broader reconstruction of Mesopotamian landscapes, settlement history, and river behaviour. Their work shows a region constantly shaped by moving water. The rivers were not fixed blue lines behaving politely between permanent banks. Channels migrated. Levees formed. Sediment accumulated. Wetlands expanded and contracted. Settlements gained or lost access to waterways. Human engineering altered some of these processes, but never controlled them completely. You can picture a city living beside such uncertainty. 1 year, irrigation works normally. Another year, unusual water levels place pressure against embankments. People strengthen weak points with baskets of earth and bundles of reeds. Officials direct labour. Farmers watch the river. Then a barrier fails. Water enters quickly. A street becomes a channel. A courtyard fills. Families move possessions onto roofs. The disaster does not need to cover the planet to feel like the destruction of the world. For someone whose entire social world lies within a few days of travel, regional catastrophe can become total experience. That possibility has shaped modern scholarly discussion. Some researchers suggest that exceptionally destructive local floods contributed memories later woven into literary tradition. Others caution that myth cannot be reduced to a geological report. A story may absorb several disasters. It may enlarge them. It may combine historical memory with religious ideas about divine judgment. The scholarly debate remains open because literature and sediment answer different questions. Sediment can show that water covered a particular place. It cannot tell you what frightened families believed while the water rose. A tablet can preserve cultural memory. It cannot function as a modern measuring instrument. Both kinds of evidence matter. Neither should be forced to say more than it can. You crouch beside the excavation wall. The flood layer looks almost modest compared with the enormous story attached to it. There are no carved gods inside the silt. No inscription says that a divine council ordered the water. There is only earth transported and deposited by natural processes. That quietness is useful. Archaeology strips away theatrical certainty. It leaves physical traces. Pottery beneath the deposit can help establish relative dates. Material above it can show when occupation resumes. Microscopic analysis may reveal how sediment formed. Regional surveys help identify settlement patterns across the wider plain. Science reconstructs catastrophe grain by grain. A curious fringe claim occasionally proposes that unusual sediment deposits across Mesopotamia prove a single worldwide flood occurring exactly as described in ancient legend. The archaeological evidence does not support that conclusion. Flood deposits identified at different sites frequently belong to different periods and local circumstances. Global geology also preserves no evidence for a recent worldwide inundation covering all the land during the age of Mesopotamian cities. The ancient story remains significant without requiring such a claim. In fact, the regional explanation may bring you closer to the human experience behind it. Imagine living through one extraordinary flood. You lose your house, your fields disappear, your neighbours vanish, the local temple is damaged, stores of grain are spoiled, travel becomes impossible. For you, there may be no meaningful difference between the destruction of your district and the destruction of everything. News travels slowly. Horizons define reality. A survivor can sincerely say the whole land disappeared beneath water because the whole land he knows has disappeared. Memory then changes as it moves through generations. A child hears the story from a parent. That child grows old and tells another generation. Specific names fade. Distances erase. The remembered storm becomes the great storm. One ruined settlement becomes many. Human memory does not preserve disasters like sealed clay jars. It reshapes them. Researchers in anthropology and historical studies have long recognized that oral traditions can preserve genuine memories while transforming details through retelling. A story can remain connected to real events without serving as a literal transcript. That distinction allows the Mesopotamian flood tradition to occupy an intriguing middle ground. It may contain historical memory. It certainly contains literary creation. It also contains theology. You walk across the ancient plain in your imagination. The ground beneath your feet looks dry, but old river channels lie hidden beneath fields and modern settlements. Satellite research and landscape archaeology have revealed traces of abandoned waterways crossing southern Iraq. Some once carried enough water to support major communities. Others shifted away, leaving settlements isolated. The landscape itself behaves almost like a palimpsest. Old watercourses remain as faint scars. New ones replace them. Human settlements follow. Civilization moves with water because water controls possibility. This helps explain why flood stories emerge so naturally here. People depend upon the same force they fear. A river brings grain. A river carries trade. A river feeds animals. A river also enters houses without permission. There is no simple enemy. Water is life made dangerous. Perhaps that is why the flood becomes such a powerful symbol in Mesopotamian thought. It does not arrive from some completely alien force. It comes through the ordinary foundation of civilization. The familiar turns against you. The thing that sustains life becomes capable of erasing it. That reversal gives the story emotional credibility even when its literary scale exceeds any known archaeological event. You return to the excavation trench. A brush moves gently across buried pottery. A worker clears another few centimetres of soil. Nothing dramatic happens. That is how much of archaeology proceeds. Carefully, slowly, without forcing conclusions. The deeper mystery survives because certainty remains incomplete. There were severe floods. There were destroyed settlements. There were displaced communities. There were scribes who later preserved stories of overwhelming water and divine judgment. How exactly those facts became one of humanity's most enduring flood traditions remains uncertain. The ground offers fragments. The tablets offer fragments. Between them lies memory. And memory, like a river, rarely follows only one channel. The night sky appears almost empty when you first look upward. There are stars, certainly, but no visible throne, no descending messenger, and no divine figure standing above the rooftops. Still, the city behaves as though heaven remains attentive. Priests maintain rituals. Kings consult specialists. Families whisper prayers beside sleeping children. Merchants swear oaths before gods whose faces they may never see. The silence itself begins to acquire meaning. Perhaps a divine withdrawal was never imagined as complete abandonment. Perhaps distance became part of the sacred system. That possibility changes how you understand the ancient world. A god who appears openly can be questioned. A god whose intentions arrive through signs remains harder to challenge. Mystery creates authority. Human beings are left to interpret rather than simply observe. This does not mean Mesopotamian religion deliberately invented distance to control people. History is more complicated than that. Yet institutions naturally grow around difficult access. When knowledge is uncertain, specialists become important. When divine will is hidden, interpreters gain responsibility. When rulers claim divine favour, political authority can borrow strength from sacred mystery. The result is a world where silence has structure. You walk along a street just before dawn. The stones are cool beneath your sandals. A baker has already begun working. Somewhere nearby, a temple servant unlocks a gate. A scholar watches the sky for the last visible stars. Everyone performs a different task, yet their activities belong to the same ordered city. That order may help explain why divine presence becomes increasingly formal. Large societies require system. Systems create roles. Roles create boundaries. The sacred world changes with them. Risto Virgis at the University of Chicago and Yale University have studied how Mesopotamian religious institutions developed, alongside increasingly complex political and administrative structures. Their work shows that temples, courts, scribal schools, and royal governments became deeply interconnected across long periods. Religion did not disappear as states grew more complicated. It became more organized. Divine authority entered law, kingship, warfare, agriculture, medicine, and scholarship. The gods became less casually visible as in stories of everyday life, while becoming more deeply embedded in institutions. That's a curious transformation. Presence becomes less personal and more systemic. You may never encounter a god standing beside a canal, yet a legal oath invokes one. A royal inscription credits another. A physician uses ritual words alongside practical treatment. A diviner consults a third before military action. The sacred world surrounds you through procedure. This raises a difficult scholarly question. Did Mesopotamians themselves perceive a historical decline in direct divine contact, or are modern readers imposing that pattern upon texts created in very different periods? The debate remains. Some scholars emphasize literary changes in how divine beings interact with humans across genres and centuries. Others caution that myths, hymns, omens, prayers, and royal inscriptions should not be arranged into one simple timeline of increasing distance. Different texts serve different purposes. A myth may show God speaking directly because stories need dialogue. A ritual tablet may focus on procedure because ritual requires precision. A royal inscription may present divine support through formal language because kingship demands legitimacy. Genre can imitate historical change. That warning matters. Ancient evidence rarely agrees to become a single story simply because modern readers want one. Yet another possibility remains. Perhaps the sense of divine distance reflects a genuine transformation in social experience rather than one sudden theological event. As cities grow larger, fewer people participate directly in central institutions. As priestly knowledge becomes specialized, sacred communication becomes more technical. As political systems expand, ordinary individuals encounter authority through officials rather than rulers. The structure of society itself becomes more distant.
Heaven may mirror that experience.
A villager's god can feel close. An imperial god can feel immense. Scale changes intimacy. You can feel the difference by imagining two forms of worship. In a small community, sacred space may stand near every household. The same families maintain local traditions for generations. In a large capital, enormous sanctuaries dominate districts filled with administrators, workers, specialists, and visiting officials. The deity becomes grander. The institution becomes more impressive. Access becomes more carefully controlled. Power increases. Familiarity decreases. Papsamats grows from grandeur. That interpretation does not require the gods to leave. It requires human society to change around them. A curious fringe theory suggests that divine silence reflects the physical departure of advanced beings who once ruled ancient populations openly. Supporters sometimes argue that later religious traditions preserved only memories of those vanished visitors. No reliable archaeological evidence supports this idea. Excavated cities reveal human technologies developing through recognizable processes involving local materials, experimentation, trade, and accumulated knowledge. There are no verified machines, installations, or biological remains requiring non-human rulers. The theory survives because it gives silence a literal explanation. The gods stop appearing because they physically depart. It is a clean answer. Ancient evidence is rarely clean. The more historically grounded explanation may be less dramatic and more interesting. People continue experiencing divine presence even when divine appearance becomes indirect. A dream can carry authority without a visible visitor. A temple can concentrate sacred presence without proving physical residence. An omen can influence a king without producing a voice. Religion adapts to distance. Perhaps humans become better at living with uncertainty. Or perhaps they become more dependent upon systems designed to manage it. You sit beside a scribe copying an omen collection. He does not seem disappointed that the gods remain invisible. He has work to do. A sign must be interpreted. A previous example must be found. A conclusion must be reported. For him, hidden divine intention is not evidence of absence. It is a professional problem. That attitude tells you something important. Silence can become normal. Once a culture develops reliable ways to interpret sacred uncertainty, direct appearance may no longer be necessary. The god remains powerful precisely because the god can act through the world. Weather becomes language. Dream becomes language. Disease becomes language. Political fortune becomes language. Nature itself becomes the medium. This creates a universe thick with meaning. It also creates fear. If everything can signify divine intention, then almost nothing feels completely accidental. A failed harvest may become judgment. A sudden illness may become warning. A military defeat may become abandonment. People search for the hidden causes because visible causes never feel sufficient. Mesopotamian prayers sometimes reveal this anxiety with painful clarity. A sufferer may insist that he does not know which offense angered the gods. He may have followed known rituals and still find himself in distress. The problem becomes almost philosophical. How do you obey when the rule you broke remains hidden? Scholars at Oxford University have examined such texts as expressions of uncertainty within Mesopotamian religion. They reveal believers wrestling with divine justice rather than accepting every misfortune without question. Faith includes confusion. Devotion includes complaint. Silence forces interpretation not only of events, but of one's own behaviour. Perhaps you offended a god unknowingly. Perhaps an ancestor neglected an obligation. Perhaps a ritual was performed incorrectly. Perhaps divine reasoning simply lies beyond human understanding. The possibilities multiply because certainty has disappeared. This may be where sacred silence becomes most powerful. A visible god can explain anger. An invisible god leaves you searching. You begin to inspect your actions. You seek advice. You perform rituals. You consult specialists. You try to restore balance without knowing exactly what disturbed it. Silence becomes a force shaping behavior from within. Yet punishment is only one interpretation. Another possibility is theological maturity. As cultures develop more complex ideas of divine power, gods may become too great for ordinary visibility. A being governing storms, kingship, fertility, justice, and cosmic order cannot easily remain merely a large person walking through city streets. Divinity expands conceptually. The more powerful the god becomes, the less physical appearance may matter. Presence shifts from body to influence. You do not need to see the wind to feel it. You do not need to see authority to obey it. Perhaps divine distance grows naturally from divine scale. You stand beneath the first light of dawn. The stars fade one by one. No god appears. Still, temple doors open. Offerings are prepared. A king waits for interpretation. A family whispers a prayer. The city continues beneath an unseen order. Perhaps silence is not evidence that the gods have gone. Perhaps silence is the form their presence has taken. And perhaps humanity learns to live most deeply with the sacred when certainty is no longer available. Moonlight rests across the remains of a temple whose doors no longer exist. Wind moves softly through broken brickwork, carrying dust into chambers once filled with incense, music, bread, and careful human footsteps. The sanctuary is empty, it's empty now. No priest approaches with oil. No musician waits beside the courtyard. No royal messenger arrives carrying questions for the divine household. Yet beneath the ruined floor, clay tablets still hold names of gods who were once treated as living powers. The city has fallen zond. The gods have not been erased. This strange distinction follows Mesopotamian religion across thousands of years. Cities disappear while divine names continue elsewhere. Dynasties collapse while rituals survive under new rulers. Languages change while scribes copy compositions inherited from distant generations. A deity can lose one temple and receive another. Sacred geography shifts, but divine memory proves remarkably difficult to destroy. Archaeography confirms this endurance. Researchers from the University of Chicago, Yale University, and Oxford University have studied religious traditions that persist across enormous political changes in ancient Mesopotamia. Sumerian cities lose political Akkadian becomes increasingly important. Babylonian and Assyrian kingdom rise. Foreign armies enter the region. Still, many ancient gods remain known, worshipped, renamed, combined, or reinterpreted across centuries. That continuity is one of the strongest arguments against imagining a simple moment when the gods suddenly disappear. The historical record suggests transformation instead. You walk through an abandoned temple precinct in your imagination. Grass grows where officials once carried offerings. Birds nest inside damaged walls. Rain has rounded the exposed edges of mud brick. Nothing here suggests supernatural occupation. Yet excavation produces something stranger than presence. It produces memory. A tablet emerges from compacted soil. Its surface contains a hymn. Another preserves an offering list. Another records a royal dedication. A broken seal carries a divine symbol. The physical objects remain long after the people who understood them directly have disappeared. That survival creates a peculiar form of immortality. The gods continue speaking through human records even when their temples become ruins. Not literally, of course. Clay has no voice, but every inscription preserves the fact that someone once addressed the unseen with complete seriousness. You hold the imagined tablet carefully. The edges are chipped. One corner is missing. Still, the signs preserve a prayer asking for protection. The person who made it expected a divine listener. That expectation is now more durable than the body of the person who prayed. This may be the quietest form of survival in ancient religion. Belief outlives believers. A curious fringe theory claims that certain Mesopotamian gods deliberately withdrew from direct human contact while continuing to observe civilization from hidden locations. Some versions imagine remote refuges beneath deserts, mountains, or even beyond Earth. No reliable archaeological evidence supports these ideas. The evidence points toward human religious traditions developing through social, political, and intellectual change. Yet the fringe theory survives because it gives literal form to an ancient emotional pattern. Something powerful was once closer. Something powerful becomes harder to reach. Something powerful may still be watching. The historical explanation is less cinematic, but perhaps more haunting. Human societies themselves may create the experience of divine distance. As sacred institutions become larger, access becomes more regulated. As priestly knowledge becomes specialized, ordinary people depend upon intermediaries. As royal theology expands, gods become associated with kingdoms, cosmic order, justice, war, fertility, and the heavens. Their scale grows. Familiarity shrinks. A household spirit can feel close enough to whisper beside a doorway. A god governing the fate of empires belongs to a different emotional distance. Perhaps greatness itself creates them. The scholarly debate remains open over whether Mesopotamian texts preserve a genuine remembered transition from direct divine interaction toward mediated religion. Some historians caution strongly against arranging myths into a single historical sequence. Different literary genres use divine speech differently. A hymn, omen text, epic ritual instruction, and royal inscription cannot be treated as simple stages of one evolving theology. Others observe that the repeat importance of mediation still reveals something significant about ancient religious experience. Dreams require interpreters. Omens require specialists. Temples require priests. Kings require divine legitimacy. Sacred knowledge repeatedly passes through controlled channels. Whatever caused that pattern, direct access remains exceptional. You can feel the consequences in ordinary life. A farmer does not need to see a god to worry about divine favor. A mother does not require an apparition before placing a protective object near her child. A ruler does not need a heavenly visitor before delaying a campaign because specialists report dangerous signs. The gods influence behavior through expectation. That influence may be quieter than visible intervention. It can also be more constant. You carry an unseen possibility everywhere. Perhaps the illness means something. Perhaps the dream matters. Perhaps the storm is ordinary. Perhaps it is not. Uncertainty keeps the sacred world close. There is gentle irony in that. If the gods appeared every morning and explained themselves clearly, entire professions might become unnecessary. No dream interpreter would be required. No omen collection would need thousands of entries. Humanity would simply Instead, silence creates scholarship. People watch, they record, they compare, they argue, they preserve. The hidden divine world encourages visible human systems of knowledge. That pattern may help explain why Mesopotamian religion leaves such enormous textual archives. Question produces records. Uncertainty produces interpretation. Fear produces ritual. Hope produces prayer. The gods become culturally durable because people continually respond to their absence as though absence itself contains meaning. You step outside the ruined sanctuary. The moon has moved slightly across the skies. Far beyond the archaeological mound, modern lights shimmer near roads that ancient builders could never have imagined. The civilization that built this temple is gone. Its political system is gone. Its language survives mostly through scholarship. Its gods no longer receive daily meals here. Yet they're missed. Their names are spoken again whenever a tablet is translated. That fact feels almost paradoxical. The old worship ended. The old stories did not. Human curiosity has reopened chambers that ritual silence once protected. Museums now hold objects originally intended for gods. Universities teach languages once used by temple scribes. Researchers reconstruct prayers whose singers disappeared thousands of years ago. The gods have become subjects of fierce art, our history. Yet history gives them another kind of presence. You cannot ask Enki a question. You can read how ancient people imagined his wisdom. You cannot enter the original sanctuary and observe its living ritual. You can reconstruct fragments from architecture, tablets, seal impressions, and offering records. Every answer creates another uncertainty. That is fitting. The Mesopotamian sacred world was already built around interpretation. Modern scholarship continues interpreting, though its questions are different. Perhaps the deepest mystery is therefore not whether ancient gods physically remained somewhere beyond human sight. There is no evidence requiring that conclusion. The deeper mystery concerns why humans continue sensing presence through absence. An empty room can feel occupied by memory. A broken statue can still command attention. A dead language can still disturb the imagination. A flood story copied onto clay can still make you wonder whether catastrophe changed more than landscape. Maybe divine silence expresses punishment. Maybe it expresses political transformation. Maybe it reflects the growing complexity of religion. Maybe the idea of distant gods simply helps humans live with a universe that rarely explains itself. No single answer closes the door. The ruined temple stands beneath the stars. Its sanctuary is dark. Its offerings have ended. Its doors are gone. All gone. Still, somewhere beneath the soil, another tablet may remain unread. And perhaps the story is not yet complete. Word count 1174. The night grows softer now. You leave the broken sanctuary without needing to solve what happened there. The wind continues moving across the ancient mound, touching stone, dust, dry grass, and fragments that have waited quietly beneath the earth. Nothing asked you for certainty. You can allow the unanswered questions to remain where they are. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to approach a civilization separated from you by thousands of years. You do not need to make its gods modern. You do not need to prove that its stories happened exactly as written. You only need to notice what human beings carried through catastrophe. They carried names. They carried rituals. They carried fear. They carried memory. And when direct answers failed them, they learned to read dreams, stars, silence, and the fragile patterns of ordinary life. Above you, the same night sky stretches beyond the old river plain. The stars seem distant, but distance does not make them unreal. So you let that image settle quietly. A ruined city sleeps beneath moonlight. Ancient canals lie hidden under soil. A temple doorway opens only in imagination. Somewhere below, clay still holds the pressure of a scribe's hand. No voice rises from the darkness. Nothing needs to. The questions are enough. Your breathing slows with the stillness of the landscape. The river moves somewhere beyond sight, continuing the patient work it has performed for ages. Water carries silt. Wind carries dust. Time carries stories. And perhaps the gods of ancient Mesopotamia were never remembered because humanity knew where they had gone. Perhaps they endured because nobody could be certain. Their silence left space for fear, devotion, interpretation, and wonder. So the temple fades into darkness. The stars remain overhead. The unanswered door stays gently open. And perhaps the story is not yet complete. Good night.